My family laughed when I walked into my sister's wedding alone. She could not even find a date, my father screamed before pushing me into the fountain. The guests clapped. I smiled through the water and said, "Remember this moment." 35 minutes later, my secret billionaire husband arrived, and they all went pale. My name is Nina, and I am 33 years old. I work as a covert cybersecurity consultant, a job my family has always dismissed as typing in a dark room. What they did not know was that my work had made me incredibly wealthy and completely independent. They also did not know that for the past 2 years, I had been happily married to Harrison Cole, a man whose name moved financial markets. I kept my success and my marriage entirely hidden because I knew exactly how my toxic family operated. If they knew I had money, they would bleed me dry. If they knew I had happiness, they would try to poison it. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic relatives who wildly underestimated your worth. Growing up in a pristine neighborhood outside of Boston taught me early on that appearances were the only currency my parents valued. My father, Richard, ran a logistics firm that relied heavily on social networking and projected wealth. My mother, Catherine, was a master at keeping up those appearances. My younger sister, Brittany, learned their rules perfectly. She was the golden child, always wearing the right brands, befriending the right people, and saying exactly what our parents wanted to hear. I was the designated scapegoat. I was quiet, analytical, and fiercely protective of my own boundaries. Because I refused to perform for their high society friends, I was labeled the difficult, underachieving daughter. I moved out the day I turned 18, financed my own education through scholarships and grueling part-time jobs, and never asked them for a single dime. Today was the ultimate showcase of their superficial world. Brittany was getting married at an ultra-lavish historic estate in Newport, Rhode Island. The venue was perched right on the edge of the ocean, a sprawling mansion surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns and grand stone fountains. I arrived at the estate wearing a tasteful conservative dark blue dress. I deliberately chose an outfit that would not draw attention. My goal was simple: drop off my gift, sit quietly in the back row, and leave before the evening dancing began. The salt air whipped across the lawn, carrying the scent of expensive catered food and fresh blooming hydrangeas. Hundreds of guests milled about the cocktail area, sipping premium champagne and showing off their designer attire. I had barely made it past the welcome archway when my mother intercepted me. Catherine wore a heavy champagne-colored gown that looked entirely too bridal for the mother of the bride. She did not offer a hug or a warm greeting. Instead, her eyes raked over my simple blue dress with absolute disdain. "You actually showed up," she said, her voice tight and low, so the nearby guests would not hear. "And wearing that. You look like you are going to a corporate seminar, not the social event of the season." I kept my expression perfectly neutral, refusing to give her the reaction she desperately wanted. "I am happy for Brittany," I replied evenly. "The floral arrangements look beautiful, Mom," she scoffed, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "They should look beautiful, considering they cost $150,000. Money you conveniently forgot to contribute to. It is customary for siblings to pitch in for family events, Nina, but I suppose we can always count on you to be selfish." I let the insult wash over me without responding. I knew the truth. My father's logistics company was drowning in debt. They had leveraged everything they owned to pay for this ridiculous spectacle, hoping to impress wealthy investors who were attending the wedding. Blaming me for their financial stress was just another way to avoid taking responsibility for their own poor choices. I offered a polite nod and attempted to walk past her toward the guest seating chart. Before I could take 3 steps, a heavy hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. It was my father. Richard wore an impeccably tailored tuxedo, but his face was flushed red with the kind of high blood pressure that comes from severe financial panic. He did not say a word to me. He simply tightened his grip and physically steered me away from the mingling guests, pushing me behind the massive white catering tent where we were hidden from public view. "What are you doing, Dad?" I asked forcefully. shrugging his heavy hand off my shoulder. He reached inside his tuxedo jacket and pulled out a thick, folded piece of premium paper. He shoved it directly against my chest, forcing me to take it to keep it from falling to the grass. "Open it," he demanded, his voice an angry whisper. I slowly unfolded the document. It was a final invoice from the luxury catering company. My eyes scanned down to the total line, $25,000. I could see the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The catering company logo was embossed in silver ink at the top of the page. It was one of the most exclusive vendors in the state. I looked back up at him, completely bewildered by his aggressive behavior. "Why are you handing me a catering bill?" I asked. "Because you are going to pay it," he stated, his eyes cold and unblinking. "Consider it your family tax." I almost laughed at the absolute absurdity of his demand. "You want me to pay $25,000 for a wedding I had no part in planning? You have lived a completely selfish life, Nina." He sneered, pointing a finger inches from my face. "You are 33 years old, unmarried, and doing whatever obscure computer nonsense you do to barely scrape by. You bring absolutely zero value to the family name. Your sister is marrying into real money today. She is elevating all of us. The absolute least you can do to compensate for being a constant burden and an embarrassment is cover this catering invoice right now." I stared at the man who was supposed to protect and love me. He saw me as nothing more than a scapegoat and a sudden desperate source of cash for his failing facade. I carefully folded the heavy paper and held it out to him. "I am not paying your bills, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "I am a guest at this wedding, not a sponsor. You chose to throw a party you cannot afford. That is your problem to solve." His face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. The polished high society gentleman vanished entirely, replaced by the cruel bully who had terrorized my childhood. "You will pay this," he snarled, taking a threatening step forward until he was looming over me. "You owe us for everything we sacrificed to keep a miserable, ungrateful child under our roof." I held my ground, refusing to shrink away. "I owe you absolutely nothing," I replied, my voice echoing slightly against the canvas of the catering tent. "I bought my own clothes, paid my own tuition, and built my own life. If your company is failing, do not try to extort your daughter to save face." I turned my back on him. I was done hiding in the shadows of the catering tent. I began walking quickly toward the main lawn where the grand stone fountain sat, surrounded by hundreds of mingling guests. I was going to find my assigned seat and refuse to be bullied any longer. I heard his heavy dress shoes pounding on the grass behind me. I did not realize he had lost his mind until it was too late. Before I could turn around, Richard grabbed my upper arm with a bruising, vicious grip. He yanked me backward, using his momentum to spin me violently toward the wide stone edge of the estate fountain. I stumbled in my heels, desperately trying to catch my balance, but he used both of his hands to aggressively shove me directly in the chest. The impact lifted my feet off the ground. I fell backward, arms flailing through the air. The cold stone scraped against my shoulder blade as I went down. My lungs seized from the sudden shock of the frigid water. The freezing cold water swallowed me whole as I crashed heavily into the 2-foot-deep basin of the grand fountain. Water rushed up my nose and blinded my eyes. The heavy silk of my dark blue dress instantly soaked through, dragging me down against the stone bottom. I heard the music stop. The string quartet abruptly ceased playing. The lively chatter of 300 elite guests died in an instant, replaced by a collective gasp of shock. I pushed my wet hair out of my face and sat up in the freezing water. My father was standing at the edge of the fountain, rubbing the back of his neck and laughing nervously. "Oh my goodness, I am so sorry," he announced loudly, projecting his voice to the stunned crowd. "She just tripped right over her own feet. Such a clumsy accident." Then I heard another voice cutting through the silence. It was Brittany. She stood on the patio overlooking the fountain in her pristine custom wedding gown. Instead of rushing to see if her sister was hurt, she pointed her manicured finger directly at me. "She could not even find a date to bring today," Brittany screamed, her voice carrying over the manicured lawn. Now she is taking a bath in the middle of my cocktail hour to get attention. A few people chuckled. Then someone else laughed. Within seconds, several high society guests were actually clapping and laughing at the cruel spectacle. My own family had successfully turned my assault into the afternoon entertainment. I did not cry. I did not scramble out of the water in shame. I stood up slowly, the freezing water cascading off my ruined dress. I looked dead into my father's eyes, ignoring the laughter of the crowd. I smiled a cold, calculated smile through the dripping water. Remember this exact moment, I said, my voice eerily calm and carrying enough edge to make his nervous smile falter. I waded out of the stone basin, my shoes squelching on the pristine grass. I did not run toward the exit. I marched directly to the back of the reception area, dripping wet, and took my seat at the absolute worst table in the corner. I sat down, pulled back the wet sleeve of my dress, and checked my waterproof smartwatch. 35 minutes. I smoothed my ruined hair behind my ears and waited. The countdown had officially started. They had exactly 35 minutes left of their perfect illusion before my husband arrived and burned their entire world to the ground. The string quartet stopped playing with a jarring screech of a bow against a cello string. The lively chatter of 300 elite guests died in an instant, replaced by a collective gasp of shock that echoed across the manicured lawn. I sat in the freezing water of the grand stone fountain, the heavy silk of my dark blue dress instantly soaking through and dragging me down against the stone bottom. Water rushed up my nose and blinded my eyes, but I forced myself to remain completely still. I pushed my wet hair out of my face and looked up. My father was standing at the edge of the basin, rubbing the back of his neck and laughing nervously. He announced loudly to the stunned crowd that I had simply tripped over my own feet, framing his violent shove as a clumsy accident. Then I heard another voice cutting through the silence. It was Brittany. She stood on the elevated marble patio overlooking the fountain, looking like a porcelain doll in her pristine custom wedding gown. Instead of rushing down the steps to see if her sister was hurt, she pointed her manicured finger directly at me. Her face twisted into a mask of pure ugly rage. She could not even find a date to bring today. Brittany screamed, her voice carrying over the saltwater breeze and the silent crowd. Now she is taking a bath in the middle of my cocktail hour just to get attention. She is ruining my aesthetics. She is ruining my photographs. A few people near the patio chuckled. Then someone else laughed. Within seconds, several high society guests were actually clapping and laughing at the cruel spectacle. My Aunt Susan covered her mouth to hide her smirk, while my cousin David openly pointed and jeered. My own family had successfully turned my assault into the afternoon entertainment for Newport society. They stood there holding their crystal champagne flutes, finding immense joy in my public degradation. Any other person might have crumbled. Any normal sibling would have burst into tears, scrambled out of the freezing water in absolute shame, and sprinted for the parking lot to hide in their car. That was exactly what my father wanted. That was the reaction Brittany craved. They wanted me broken, defeated, and banished from their perfect day. But I did not cry. I did not scramble. The freezing water numbed my skin, but a different kind of coldness settled into my chest, a hard, unbreakable resolve. I stood up slowly, deliberately, letting the water cascade off my ruined designer dress. The heavy fabric clung to my legs, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. I stepped forward until I was standing knee-deep in the water directly in front of where my father stood on the grass. The laughter around the fountain began to die down as the guests noticed I was not running away. I looked dead into my father's eyes. I saw the brief flash of uncertainty cross his features when he realized I was not breaking. He shifted his weight uncomfortably, his nervous smile faltering. I smiled. It was a cold, calculated smile through the dripping water. Remember this exact moment, I said, my voice eerily calm and carrying enough edge to slice through the humid ocean air. Remember what you just did. My father opened his mouth to deliver another insult, but the words died in his throat. He took a small, involuntary step back from the edge of the fountain. He did not understand the threat, but he could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The scapegoat was no longer playing her assigned role. I waded out of the stone basin, my ruined shoes squelching heavily on the pristine green grass. I did not run toward the exit. I did not head for the valet stand to retrieve my car. Instead, I marched directly toward the main reception tent. The sea of guests parted for me as if I carried a contagious disease. Women in expensive pastel gowns pulled their skirts away to avoid the water dripping from my clothes. Men in tailored suits averted their eyes, whispering behind their hands as I passed. I walked with my head held high, my shoulders pulled back, refusing to give them the satisfaction of my humiliation. I left a trail of dark water across the white dance floor, passing the extravagant floral centerpieces and the towering wedding cake. I headed for the absolute worst table in the venue. It was table 42, tucked away in the darkest corner of the tent, located dangerously close to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen and the temporary restroom trailers. It was the table reserved for the guests my parents felt obligated to invite, but desperately wanted to hide. I pulled out a chair and sat down. The wet fabric of my dress slapped against the wooden seat. I wrung out the ends of my hair, letting the water pool on the floor beneath me. Across the tent, I could see my mother Catherine marching furiously toward the catering captain. She pointed frantically in my direction, her face red with indignation. I watched as the catering captain nodded rapidly and relayed instructions to the waitstaff. The message was clear. I was to be completely ignored. A young server carrying a tray of warm appetizers passed by my table. He looked at me with genuine pity and took a half step toward me, offering the tray. Before he could speak, the catering captain snapped his fingers from across the room, shaking his head sharply. The young server mouthed an apology, dropped his gaze, and hurried away. They were going to freeze me out, hoping the sheer discomfort of sitting in wet clothes while being socially shunned would finally break my spirit and force me to leave. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I pulled back the soaking wet sleeve of my dress and checked my wrist. My smartwatch was fully waterproof. The screen illuminated brightly in the dim corner of the tent. It was exactly 4:25 in the afternoon. 35 minutes. I smoothed my ruined hair behind my ears, folded my hands on my lap, and waited. The countdown had officially started. They had exactly 35 minutes left of their perfect illusion before my husband arrived and burned their entire world to the ground. My mind drifted to Harrison. We had met 3 years ago when my firm was hired to run a massive cybersecurity audit on the servers of his primary venture capital fund. He was notoriously ruthless in business, fiercely private, and incredibly demanding. When I successfully breached his network in under 4 hours, he did not fire my firm. He asked me to dinner. We were married a year later in a tiny private ceremony on the Amalfi Coast with only 2 witnesses. I kept my marriage to a billionaire titan of industry a total secret from my family because I knew their greed knew no bounds. If Richard knew his daughter was married to Harrison Cole, he would have demanded investments, bailouts, and board seats. If Catherine knew, she would have used his name to climb the social ladder she worshipped so desperately. I kept Harrison away from their toxicity to protect our peace. But today they had crossed the final line. They had not just insulted me, they had physically assaulted me and humiliated me for sport. Before the ceremony, I had sent a brief encrypted text to Harrison, telling him I would likely leave early because the hostility was already escalating. He had replied with a simple message: "I am already in the air. Give me an hour." I sat at table 42, shivering slightly as the ocean breeze blew through the open flaps of the tent. The physical discomfort meant nothing. Every time a cousin cast a mocking glance my way, every time my mother glared at me from the head table, I simply smiled, the anticipation warming me from the inside out. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully put the useless spinster sister back in her place. I looked down at my watch again. 4:52. The best man was tapping his glass with a silver spoon, calling the room to attention for the toasts. He was a smug, arrogant man who worked for my father's failing logistics firm. I watched him take the microphone, completely unaware of the absolute devastation heading directly for this manicured lawn. He stood up, adjusting his expensive tie, and launched into a speech filled with inside jokes and corporate flattery. To Brittany and Preston, he announced, raising his glass. A couple so perfect they make the rest of us look bad. Well, most of us. He paused, his eyes deliberately finding my dark corner. Some people do not need any help looking bad. Some people just dive right into it. The crowd erupted into fresh laughter. My father slapped the table in amusement. My mother beamed. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on the digital face of my watch. Just 8 minutes left. Let them enjoy their champagne. Let them laugh. The bill was coming due. Greg, the best man, and my father's newly promoted vice president of operations, gripped the microphone tightly. He paced the edge of the elevated dance floor, soaking up the undivided attention of the Newport elite. He spent the first 5 minutes showering Brittany and Preston with sickeningly sweet compliments, praising their impeccable pedigree, their flawless aesthetic, and their bright future. Then, like a predator spotting an easy and defenseless target, his eyes flicked toward the back of the tent. He found me sitting alone in my soaked dress at table 42. Greg smirked, knowing exactly what his boss wanted to hear. You know, looking at the bride and groom today, you realize what true success really looks like. Greg announced, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. Success is about building alliances. It is about knowing how to fit into the right circles, playing the game, and elevating the people around you. Of course, not everyone understands that concept. Every successful family has to carry some dead weight. Some people are just destined to be anchors dragging the rest of the ship down into the mud, or in this case, plunging face first into the fountain. The cruelty of the joke struck the crowd like a spark landing in dry grass. A roar of laughter erupted from the tables near the front. Brittany covered her mouth, giggling hysterically, while leaning into Preston's shoulder, her diamond earrings catching the light as she shook with amusement. My mother. Catherine wiped a delicate tear of mirth from her eye, completely validating the public humiliation of her eldest daughter. My father raised his premium champagne flute toward Greg in a silent, arrogant gesture of absolute approval. They were reveling in their perceived power, completely intoxicated by the deeply flawed belief that they could break me without consequence. I did not break. I did not avert my gaze or stare at the floor in shame. I picked up a stiff linen napkin, slowly wiped a rogue drop of fountain water from my cheek, and looked back down at my wrist. 4:56. The seconds ticked by with agonizing precision. The air inside the sprawling canvas tent felt thick, heavy with the natural humidity of the ocean, and the suffocating arrogance of the 300 guests who genuinely thought they ruled the world. They were about to learn exactly how incredibly small their world actually was. Before Greg could launch into another humiliating punchline, a strange, rhythmic vibration began to ripple through the wooden floorboards of the reception tent. It started as a low, barely perceptible hum. Something felt deep in the chest, rather than heard by the ears. Greg tapped the microphone, frowning in confusion, as a low feedback whine shrieked through the towering speakers. He opened his mouth to speak again, but his words were instantly drowned out by a deafening rhythmic thumping that seemed to fall directly from the sky above us. The crystal champagne flutes on table 42 began to rattle aggressively against the fine porcelain plates. Across the venue, the expensive, towering floral arrangements shivered and shook. The heavy canvas walls of the reception tent violently snapped back and forth as a massive invisible downdraft descended upon the historic estate. Women shrieked in sudden panic, frantically grabbing the brims of their designer hats to keep them from flying away into the wind. Men spilled their expensive drinks on their tailored suits, looking up at the ceiling of the tent in sheer terror. The thumping grew into an ear-splitting mechanical roar. Beyond the open flaps of the tent, the bright afternoon sky suddenly darkened as a massive aircraft blotted out the sun. It was a Sikorsky helicopter, painted completely in a stealthy matte black finish, without a single identifying corporate logo or tail number visible to the naked eye. It hovered for a terrifying, agonizing second over the manicured grass before smoothly descending toward the estate's private helipad, located just 50 yards away from where Brittany and Preston sat, frozen in fear at their sweetheart table. The sheer, overwhelming force of the rotor wash blew the perfectly arranged white aisle runners straight into the air like loose ribbons. The water in the grand stone fountain, the exact same fountain where I had been violently shoved just 30 minutes prior, whipped into an absolute frenzy. The downdraft sent cold mist spraying aggressively across the terrified, cowering guests in the front rows. As the heavy helicopter touched down onto the concrete pad, the chaos instantly compounded. The heavy wrought iron gates at the main entrance of the estate suddenly swung open with tremendous force. The rented security guards hired by my father tried to step forward to block the path, but they immediately backed away with their hands raised when three massive, heavily armored black SUVs breached the perimeter. The vehicles did not stop at the designated valet loop. They drove aggressively and directly onto the pristine, perfectly manicured lawn, crushing the expensive landscaping and flower beds beneath their heavy tires. The SUVs moved with flawless, terrifying military precision. They formed a tight tactical barricade that shielded the pathway between the helipad and the reception tent. The massive engine of the Sikorsky began to power down the deafening roar, slowly dropping to a high-pitched mechanical whine that hung in the tense air. The 300 elite guests were absolutely paralyzed. Frantic murmurs of awe, confusion, and raw terror rippled through the crowd. This was a display of wealth, power, and aggressive security that entirely eclipsed my parents' rented, debt-fueled spectacle. This was not old money or local Newport society attempting to show off. This was apex predator-level power asserting absolute dominance over the space. My father Richard stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the floor. I watched his face transition from pure, unadulterated terror to a frantic, manic excitement. He quickly grabbed my mother by the arm, whispering furiously into her ear while pointing at the helicopter. I knew exactly what was running through his desperate, greedy mind. His logistics company had been hemorrhaging money for 3 long years. He was teetering on the very edge of total unrecoverable bankruptcy, begging every private equity firm on the East Coast for a miraculous financial bailout. In his delusional, arrogant mind, he fully believed a billionaire investor had decided to crash his daughter's wedding to make a dramatic entrance and save his failing empire. Richard barked a frantic order at the catering captain, demanding a fresh tray of the most expensive champagne they had on site. He practically shoved his way past his wealthy friends, his chest puffed out with unearned pride as he hurried toward the edge of the tent to greet his imagined savior. He stood at the edge of the crushed lawn, a sycophantic, eager smile plastered across his flushed face, waiting for the helicopter doors to slide open. The side door of the Sikorsky slid back smoothly. 4 men stepped out first. They were not wearing the standard-issue security blazers of a normal executive detail. They wore dark, tailored suits with discreet earpieces moving with a cold, calculated efficiency that immediately commanded absolute compliance from everyone in the vicinity. They flanked the pathway, their sharp eyes scanning the crowd, identifying and cataloging every potential threat in the area. Then Harrison stepped out into the Rhode Island sun. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that fit his tall, athletic frame flawlessly. His dark hair was slightly tousled by the fading wind of the rotors, but his face was completely impassive, carved from pure stone. Harrison Cole radiated a lethal, quiet authority that required no introduction and demanded absolute respect. The venture capital billionaire did not look at the beautiful ocean view. He did not look at the extravagant, overpriced wedding decorations. His sharp, dark eyes scanned the silent tent with terrifying, focused intensity, searching for one specific target. Richard, practically vibrating with desperate ambition and greed, stepped directly into Harrison's intended path. He extended his right hand, his smile wide, fake, and desperate for validation. Mr. Cole, Richard announced loudly, ensuring the surrounding guests could hear his supposed familiarity with the billionaire. "What an absolute honor to have you here. I am Richard, the father of the bride and the CEO of the logistics firm we discussed in emails." Harrison did not even blink. He did not slow his purposeful stride. He walked straight past my father, leaving Richard's eager hand hanging pathetically in the empty air. Before Richard could process the blatant, humiliating disrespect, the lead security operative effortlessly shouldered him out of the way, treating the host of the wedding like an inconvenient, invisible piece of furniture. Richard stumbled backward awkwardly, crashing into a floral pillar, his face instantly draining of all color as his colleagues watched him get brutally dismissed. Harrison completely ignored the shocked gasps of the elite crowd. He ignored the bride and groom staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. He marched directly into the center of the tent, his heavy footsteps echoing on the wooden floorboards, heading straight for the darkest corner in the back of the room. He was heading straight for table 42. He was heading straight for table 42. The sea of wealthy guests parted immediately for him. No one dared to speak or even breathe too loudly as the billionaire strode through the reception tent. The heavy silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the helicopter rotors winding down in the distance. Harrison did not cast a single glance toward the massive floral centerpieces or the towering wedding cake. His entire focus was locked onto the dark corner where I sat shivering in my ruined blue dress. His 4 security operatives moved with him, creating an impenetrable moving barrier that kept the curious and terrified guests at a strict distance. They fanned out as Harrison reached my table, establishing a secure perimeter. The catering captain, who had previously ordered his staff to ignore me, took 3 rapid steps backward, his face draining of all color as he realized he had been starving the wife of a billionaire. Harrison stopped directly in front of my chair. He looked down at the puddle of water pooled beneath my feet. He looked at my soaked hair clinging to my face and the ruined silk of my dress clinging to my skin. The lethal stone-cold expression he had worn since stepping off the helicopter did not soften, but his eyes changed when they met mine. There was a dangerous, simmering fury beneath the calm surface, a quiet promise of absolute destruction for whoever had caused this. Without saying a word, Harrison smoothly unbuttoned his bespoke charcoal suit jacket. He slipped it off his broad shoulders and gently draped it over my shivering frame. The heavy, expensive wool was incredibly warm, instantly blocking the chill of the ocean breeze. It smelled like cedar and expensive cologne, a familiar, comforting scent that grounded me in the chaos of the room. He leaned down, resting his hands firmly on the arms of my cheap wooden chair, and pressed a long, protective kiss to my forehead. "I am here," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble meant only for me. "You are safe now." I nodded once, pulling the lapels of his warm jacket tighter around my chest. I knew I was safe. It was the rest of the people in this tent who needed to be terrified. Harrison stood back up to his full height. He slowly turned around to face the silent, paralyzed room. His dark eyes swept across the 300 guests before locking directly onto the elevated patio where my family stood, frozen like statues. "Who touched my wife?" Harrison asked. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a terrifying, deadly calm that carried perfectly through the dead silence of the tent. The question hit the crowd like a physical shockwave. The word wife dropped into the center of the reception like a live grenade. A collective gasp rippled through the elite crowd. The whispered realization spread from table to table with lightning speed. The woman they had just spent the last 45 minutes mocking, laughing at, and actively shunning was married to Harrison Cole. She was not a pathetic single spinster who could not find a date. She was the matriarch of an absolute financial empire. On the elevated patio, the golden child physically stumbled backward. Brittany gripped the edge of her sweetheart table, her knuckles turning stark white as she stared at Harrison and me. Her mouth opened and closed in rapid succession, but no sound came out. The pristine custom wedding gown she wore suddenly looked incredibly cheap compared to the absolute power radiating from the dark corner of the tent. She looked from Harrison to my soaked dress, and the realization of what she had done finally crashed over her. She had just publicly humiliated the wife of a man who could buy and sell her new husband's entire family with pocket change. Beside her, Preston looked equally devastated. The arrogant groom who had spent the entire cocktail hour turning a blind eye to my abuse now looked like he was standing on the gallows. He swallowed hard, taking a distinct step away from Brittany, as if trying to physically distance himself from the toxic fallout of her cruelty. He knew the business implications of this disaster. His own career, his family wealth, and his social standing were all intimately tied to the exact venture capital markets that Harrison controlled. My mother, Catherine, remained entirely motionless. Her heavy champagne-colored gown seemed to swallow her small frame as she stared at the scene unfolding at table 42. The social facade she had spent decades meticulously building shattered into a million irreparable pieces in a matter of seconds. The daughter she had consistently degraded, compared, and hidden away was currently wrapped in the bespoke jacket of a billionaire titan. Every terrible comment she had made, every public insult she had hurled, every deliberate exclusion she had orchestrated, suddenly played back in her mind. She realized with absolute horrifying clarity that she had completely alienated the most powerful connection her family would ever possess. The high society guests who had previously clapped at my humiliation suddenly found the floor incredibly interesting. They desperately avoided making eye contact with Harrison or his security team. The women who had pulled their pastel skirts away from my wet clothes now looked visibly nauseous. The men who had laughed at Greg's cruel joke stared rigidly ahead, praying they would not be noticed or remembered. The entire social hierarchy of the room inverted in an instant. The people who thought they held all the power were suddenly trapped in a tent with the apex predator they had just deeply offended. The paralyzing silence dragged on for 10 agonizing seconds. It was my father who finally broke it. Richard could not comprehend the reality in front of him, but his desperate, greedy survival instincts kicked into overdrive. His logistics company was drowning in massive, unrecoverable debt, and he saw Harrison Cole standing in his reception tent. He did not care about the terrifying question Harrison had just asked. He did not care about my ruined dress or my shivering frame. He only cared about saving his sinking corporate ship and avoiding the devastating consequences of his violent actions. Richard stepped off the elevated patio and marched toward our corner. He forced a wide, thoroughly fake smile onto his flushed face. He rubbed his hands together, letting out a loud, booming laugh that sounded completely unhinged in the quiet tent. He was deploying his signature tactic of aggressive gaslighting, attempting to rewrite reality through sheer volume and confidence. "Mr. Cole." Richard announced, his voice overly jovial as he approached the security perimeter. "There has clearly been a massive misunderstanding here today. Please let me formally welcome you to our family celebration. I am Richard. Nina is my daughter. We had no idea she was keeping such a wonderful marriage a secret from us." Harrison did not move. He did not acknowledge the greeting. He kept his dark, lethal eyes locked directly on my father's face, waiting for the answer to his question. The lead security operative shifted his stance slightly, blocking Richard from getting any closer to our table. Richard stopped abruptly, his fake smile straining at the edges as he met Harrison's cold stare. He gestured casually toward the grand stone fountain outside the tent, laughing nervously again. "The water? Yes. Well, that was just a playful family joke. A little wedding day fun that got slightly out of hand. You know how siblings can be." Nina simply lost her footing and took a clumsy tumble into the basin. It was a complete accident. Nobody touched her. I promise you, it was all just harmless fun. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He had violently grabbed my arm, spun me around, and aggressively shoved me backward into 2 feet of freezing water. 300 guests had watched him do it. Yet here he was, standing in front of my husband, boldly claiming it was a playful joke and a clumsy fall. He honestly believed his own toxic delusions. He thought he could charm his way out of a physical assault by simply rewriting the narrative and expecting everyone else to fall in line. I sat quietly in my chair, pulling the warm wool of Harrison's jacket closer to my collarbone. I did not need to shout or defend myself. I did not need to scream that he was lying. I had warned my father 35 minutes ago to remember that exact moment at the fountain. I had known that his absolute refusal to take accountability would ultimately be his permanent undoing. Harrison slowly tilted his head, studying Richard as if he were looking at a fascinating but repulsive insect. He did not raise his voice or break his terrifyingly calm demeanor. He simply let the absolute silence stretch out, allowing the blatant, transparent lie to hang heavily in the humid air. The tension in the reception tent reached a breaking point. Richard swallowed hard, a bead of cold sweat running down his temple. His booming confidence began to evaporate under the crushing weight of the billionaire's stare. He looked around the room, desperately searching for validation from his wealthy friends. But every single guest remained completely silent, refusing to support his fabricated story. He looked back at Harrison, his fake smile finally collapsing into an expression of raw, unadulterated panic as he realized his gaslighting tactics were failing spectacularly. Richard opened his mouth to try another angle, but his voice completely failed him. The wealthy socialites who had happily consumed his expensive catered food and premium alcohol just an hour ago were now actively distancing themselves from his impending destruction. They were seasoned corporate sharks and calculating investors. They recognized exactly what was happening. Richard had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He had abused the wife of a man who dictated global markets, and now he was trying to lie his way out of it to that very man's face. The complete lack of support from his peers caused a visible tremor in my father's hands. He wiped his damp palms on his expensive tuxedo pants, staring blankly at the silent crowd. He had spent his entire life bullying people into submission, using his loud voice and aggressive posture to dominate every single room he entered. He was entirely accustomed to people cowering before his demands. But standing before Harrison Cole, my father looked incredibly small, incredibly weak, and completely out of his depth. Harrison remained an immovable force. He did not flinch or react to the frantic, desperate energy my father was projecting. His absolute stillness was far more intimidating than any raised voice or physical threat could ever be. He was a man who understood the profound power of silence. He was letting my father choke on his own fabricated reality, allowing the ridiculous lie about a playful family joke to echo repeatedly in the minds of everyone present. I watched my father physically shrink under that gaze. The aggressive tyrant who had shoved me into the freezing fountain was gone, replaced by a pathetic cornered man who finally realized his actions carried severe, devastating consequences. The gaslighting had failed. The crowd had turned against him. His perfect illusion was utterly shattered, and the true nightmare for my family was only just beginning. The suffocating silence that had paralyzed the reception tent was suddenly shattered by the sharp, angry clatter of high heels striking the wooden dance floor. My father had just been completely neutralized by Harrison, but my sister was entirely incapable of reading the room. Brittany had been the golden child for her entire life, sheltered from consequences and conditioned to believe that her emotional outbursts would bend the universe to her will. She did not see a lethal billionaire standing in the dark corner of the tent. She only saw a man who had stolen the absolute center of attention on her wedding day. She stomped down the steps of the elevated marble patio, dragging the heavy, pristine train of her custom designer gown across the water-stained floorboards. Her face was flushed with an ugly, petulant rage that contorted her usually flawless features. The high society guests, who were actively trying to blend into the shadows, stepped out of her way, watching in horrified fascination as a bride marched directly toward her own total destruction. Preston tried to catch her arm to stop her, his face already pale with apprehension, but she violently yanked her wrist out of his grasp. She marched straight up to the security perimeter Harrison had established. The lead operative shifted his weight, prepared to physically block her, but Harrison gave a microscopic shake of his head. The operative stepped aside, allowing Brittany to stand just 5 feet away from where I sat, wrapped in my husband's warm bespoke jacket. "Who do you think you are?" Brittany screamed, her shrill voice echoing painfully in the quiet tent. "You think you can just fly a helicopter onto my private venue and ruin my wedding? You blew dirt all over the floral arrangements. You ruined the entire aesthetic of my cocktail hour. This is my day, mine." She turned her furious glare toward me, pointing a shaking manicured finger. "And you planned this. You brought him here just to ruin my perfect day because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of me because I am the one who gets everything right." I did not say a word. I simply sat back in my wooden chair, letting the warmth of Harrison's jacket seep into my freezing skin. I watched her self-destruct with absolute clinical detachment. Brittany was so blinded by her own narcissism that she failed to realize the profound danger she was in. She turned her wrath back to Harrison, planting her hands on her hips and tilting her chin up in a posture of aggressive entitlement. "You owe me," she demanded loudly. "You completely hijacked my reception and terrified my guests. You are going to compensate me for this disaster. I demand you pay for my honeymoon. $100,000 for the overwater bungalow in Bora Bora. You can afford it, and you owe it to me as a penalty for ruining my spotlight." A collective gasp of sheer disbelief rippled through the elite crowd. Several prominent investors at the nearby tables actually covered their faces in secondhand embarrassment. Demanding a six-figure extortion payment from a venture capital titan because of a bruised ego was financial and social suicide. Harrison did not raise his voice. He did not flinch at her screaming. He looked down at Brittany with an expression of lethal absolute politeness that was far more terrifying than if he had drawn a weapon. He studied her for a long, silent moment, treating her like a spoiled, irrational toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. "Your demand is unequivocally denied," Harrison said, his voice a low, smooth rumble of absolute authority. "I do not fund illusions. And I certainly do not reward the people who physically assault my wife for sport." Brittany opened her mouth to shriek another demand, but Harrison did not give her the opportunity. He smoothly reached into the inner breast pocket of his charcoal suit and withdrew a single folded piece of heavy cardstock. He held it loosely between his fingers, but he did not hand it to her. Instead, his dark eyes drifted past Brittany and locked onto the groom who was hovering anxiously near the edge of the dance floor. "I highly suggest you reconsider your luxury travel plans." Harrison continued, his tone shifting from polite to surgical. "Because an overwater bungalow in Bora Bora requires a level of liquidity that your new husband simply does not possess." The color drained instantly from Preston's face. He took a noticeable involuntary step backward, bumping into a tall floral arrangement. The guests nearby turned to look at him, their aristocratic curiosity piqued by the sudden shift in the billionaire's focus. "What are you talking about?" Brittany snapped, her hands dropping from her hips. "Preston comes from a very successful family. He is a senior wealth manager." "He is an illusion," Harrison corrected coldly. "Just like this entire reception. My firm runs comprehensive background intelligence on anyone who enters my wife's proximity. We leave absolutely nothing to chance." Harrison unfolded the heavy cardstock with a crisp snap of the paper. He read from it without breaking eye contact with the groom. "Preston Vance, you currently hold 3 unlisted offshore credit accounts that you have deliberately hidden from your new bride and her family. All 3 of those accounts are maxed out to their absolute limit at a predatory 29% interest rate." Preston looked like he was going to vomit. He looked wildly around the room, desperately searching for an escape route, but the crowd had formed an impenetrable circle of judgment around the dance floor. "That is a lie," Brittany shouted, her voice trembling as the first seed of genuine doubt planted itself in her mind. "Preston bought me a custom 4-carat diamond engagement ring. He paid for the platinum wedding bands in cash. He paid for them with debt," Harrison stated flatly. "He leveraged the last remaining fraction of his available credit to purchase those rings and maintain the facade of immense wealth that your parents so desperately require. Your husband is entirely insolvent. He cannot afford a flight to Bora Bora, let alone a $100,000 vacation. He is drowning in high-interest debt, and he married you hoping your father's logistics company would provide a massive financial bailout." The silence in the tent was heavy and suffocating. The revelation hit the family like a physical blow. The entire foundation of this wedding, the strategic alliance of 2 supposedly wealthy families, was exposed as a complete fraudulent house of cards. Preston turned ghost white, his skin taking on a sickly, translucent pallor under the warm string lights of the tent. He opened his mouth to deny the accusations, but no words came out. His absolute silence was the most damning confirmation possible. Brittany slowly turned around to look at her new husband. The furious red flush of her tantrum faded, replaced by a stark, horrifying realization. "Preston, tell him he is lying," she demanded, her voice cracking with sudden vulnerability. "Tell him you have the money for the honeymoon. Tell him about the trust fund." Preston could not meet her eyes. He stared firmly at the water-stained floorboards, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. "There is no trust fund, Brittany," he whispered, his voice breaking. It was depleted years ago. I am sorry. A sharp collective murmur swept through the 300 guests. The high society elite who thrived on gossip and scandal were actively witnessing the real-time destruction of two prominent families. The pristine, perfect image my mother and father had spent decades cultivating was being violently dismantled piece by piece in front of their most important peers. My mother, Catherine, let out a strangled, horrified sound. She gripped the edge of the sweetheart table, her knuckles white as she stared at the groom she had proudly paraded in front of her country club friends for the past year. She had constantly compared me to Brittany, praising her youngest daughter for securing such a wealthy, successful match. She had used Preston's supposed financial status as a weapon to make me feel small and inadequate. Now the weapon had detonated in her own hands. The family finally realized the true magnitude of what was happening. Harrison and I had not just shown up in a helicopter to make a dramatic scene. We had not come to engage in a petty shouting match over a ruined dress. We had come armed with weaponized financial intelligence. We had performed a deep forensic audit on the entire family, extracting their most devastating secrets and bringing the receipts to the very event designed to celebrate their fake success. My father Richard realized this faster than anyone else. His panicked eyes darted from the folded piece of paper in Harrison's hand to the small waterproof flash drive I was holding loosely in my lap. He suddenly understood that if Harrison possessed the offshore banking records of his new son-in-law, then Harrison absolutely possessed the catastrophic financial records of his failing logistics firm. The power dynamic in the tent shifted with terrifying finality. The golden child was shattered, her dream wedding exposed as a fraudulent nightmare. The abusive father was trapped completely at the mercy of the billionaire he had tried to gaslight. The superficial mother was socially ruined, her elite friends witnessing her greatest humiliation. I sat quietly in my chair, the warmth of my husband's jacket protecting me from the cold ocean air. I did not gloat. I did not raise my voice or hurl insults. I simply watched them drown in the consequences of their own actions. The initial slap in the face, the push into the freezing fountain, had been their opening move. But we were playing an entirely different game, and we had just placed them in absolute, irrefutable checkmate. The crushing silence in the reception tent was broken by the sound of Brittany dropping to her knees. Her massive custom wedding gown pooled around her on the water-stained floorboards as she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Preston did not move to comfort her. He remained frozen, staring blankly ahead as the reality of his public exposure set in. Any normal father would have rushed to his youngest daughter's side to shield her from the staring eyes of the wealthy guests and offer comfort. Any normal father would have demanded Preston leave the premises immediately. But Richard was not a normal father. He was a desperate man watching his entire financial world collapse, and he saw only one escape route. I watched my father physically shake off the panic that had gripped him just seconds before. A terrifying manic energy replaced his fear. He completely ignored his weeping golden child on the floor. He ignored his wife Catherine, who was hyperventilating near the sweetheart table. His eyes locked onto Harrison with a predatory, desperate hunger. In his twisted mind, the revelation that his oldest daughter was married to a venture capital billionaire was no longer a threat. It was a massive, unprecedented opportunity. Richard straightened his tuxedo jacket and forced a wide, confident smile back onto his flushed face. He took a bold step toward the security perimeter Harrison had established. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a thick, folded document. It was a scaled-down executive summary of his logistics firm. He always carried it to high society events, hoping to corner potential investors after a few drinks. Now he intended to use it on my husband right in the middle of his other daughter's ruined wedding reception. "Mr. Cole!" Richard began, his voice booming with artificial warmth as he attempted to bridge the distance between them. "I know the timing here is highly unusual given the circumstances with Preston and Brittany. But business never truly sleeps, does it? We are both men who understand that opportunities must be seized the moment they present themselves." Harrison did not move a single muscle. He stood firmly between my chair and my father, his broad shoulders blocking the coastal wind. He did not invite Richard to continue, but he also did not order his security team to physically remove him. He simply watched my father with the cold, detached curiosity of a scientist observing a rat in a maze. Taking Harrison's silence as permission to proceed, Richard stepped closer, eagerly waving the printed executive summary. As you may know, my company handles extensive freight and supply chain operations across the eastern seaboard. Richard pitched his words tumbling out in a rapid, desperate rush. We have the infrastructure and the legacy client base, but we are currently looking for a strategic capital injection to modernize our fleet and expand our regional hubs. We have optimized our route metrics and streamlined our overhead, but the current market requires substantial liquidity to capture the emerging regional contracts. A partnership with your venture capital firm would provide the exact synergy needed to dominate the sector. I sat in my chair completely astounded by the sheer audacity of the man. Less than an hour ago, he had violently shoved me into a stone fountain over a catering bill. He had laughed while 300 guests mocked my humiliation. He had called me a selfish, useless spinster who brought absolutely zero value to the family name. Now he was actively trying to leverage my marriage to secure a multi-million-dollar bailout for his failing business. He did not offer an apology for assaulting me. He did not even look at me. He looked right through me, treating me as nothing more than a convenient stepping stone to reach Harrison's wallet. The elite guests who had not yet fled the venue watched the scene unfold with absolute disgust. The raw, shameless greed on display was staggering even for Newport society. Richard was sweating profusely now. The ocean breeze was cool, but beads of perspiration rolled down his temples and soaked into his expensive collar. He thrust the folded document toward Harrison, his hand trembling slightly with adrenaline and desperation. If you would just take a brief look at our quarterly projections, you will see the massive potential for a rapid return on investment, Richard pleaded, his voice growing louder and more frantic as Harrison refused to take the paper. I have the full financial breakdown right here. We can restructure the board to your liking. I am willing to offer you a significant equity stake straight out of the gate. We are family now, after all. We should be building our empire together. We should be combining our resources to secure generational wealth for our daughters. The word family sounded foul coming from his mouth. It was a word he only used when he wanted to extract money or compliance from the people around him. He had used it to demand I pay his catering invoice, and now he was using it to demand a corporate bailout. He spoke of generational wealth while actively attempting to steal my peace and my dignity. Harrison looked down at the trembling hand holding the executive summary. He let Richard stand there with his arm extended for agonizing stretches of time. The billionaire did not exhibit a single ounce of empathy or interest. The absolute power difference between the two men was staggering. Richard was begging for his professional life, while Harrison looked like he was deciding whether to swat away a minor nuisance. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight, pressing down on my father's chest. Then Harrison smoothly raised his right hand, holding up a single finger. The simple, quiet gesture instantly killed my father's frantic sales pitch. Richard snapped his mouth shut mid-sentence, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. He stood frozen, holding the document out desperately, hoping Harrison was about to reach for it and save him from financial ruin. He honestly believed his aggressive charm offensive was working. He thought he had successfully distracted the billionaire from the violent assault that had taken place just moments before. Harrison did not reach for the paper. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step backward, aligning himself perfectly beside my chair. He placed his large, warm hand gently on my shoulder, a silent but unmistakable declaration of absolute loyalty and protection. The gesture drew every single eye in the tent directly to me, sitting quietly in my wet clothes. The visual contrast was striking. I was soaked and shivering, but I was the one anchored to absolute unshakable power. I do not review unsolicited business proposals, Mr. Cole said, his voice dropping to a glacial, unforgiving tone. And I certainly do not entertain financial pitches from men who physically assault women. Richard visibly flinched. The forced smile completely fell off his face, leaving behind a mask of pure terror. He tried to lower his hand, but his muscles seemed locked in place. He stammered frantically, trying to backpedal. "Mr. Cole, please, you have to understand the pressure I am under. The market has been incredibly difficult. I was just stressed about the caterers, and I lost my temper. It will never happen again. I just need a moment of your time to explain the numbers and show you the value my company holds." Harrison cut him off abruptly. His voice was not loud, but it carried a lethal finality that echoed off the canvas walls of the reception tent and silenced the murmuring crowd. "I am not the person you need to convince," he stated coldly. "You are wasting your breath talking to me." My father stared at him in profound confusion. The concept of a powerful billionaire deferring to anyone else was completely alien to his patriarchal, arrogant worldview. He had spent his entire life dominating his wife and daughters, believing that men held all the true authority in the world. "What do you mean?" Richard stammered, his eyes darting frantically between Harrison's impassive face and the security operatives flanking our table. "You run the venture capital firm. You hold the purse strings. You are the only one who can authorize this kind of capital injection. You are the decision maker." Harrison looked down at me, a small, genuine smile touching the corners of his mouth for the very first time since he had stepped off the helicopter. He squeezed my shoulder gently, sending a wave of warmth through my freezing body, before turning his dark, lethal eyes back to my father. "I build the wealth," Harrison stated, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable authority. "But I do not make the portfolio decisions, my wife does." The words struck my father with the force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, dropping the executive summary onto the wet wooden floorboards, where it slowly soaked up the spilled champagne and muddy water. The realization crashed over him in a devastating tidal wave. The daughter he had spent 33 years systematically abusing, degrading, and hiding away was not just married to a billionaire. She was the sole architect of his financial empire. She was the one who held the absolute power of life and death over his failing company. Richard slowly turned his horrified gaze toward me. For the first time in my entire life, he actually looked at me. He did not see a scapegoat. He did not see a disappointment. He saw the executioner holding the axe over his corporate neck. The absolute terror in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. I sat perfectly still, allowing his total destruction to wash over the silent room. The absolute terror in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. I sat perfectly still, allowing his total destruction to wash over the silent room. Richard tried to form a sentence, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He looked at Harrison, hoping for some sign that this was a cruel joke. Harrison simply crossed his arms over his broad chest, stepping back exactly half a pace. The subtle movement was a clear physical declaration that the floor now belonged entirely to me. I slowly opened the clasp of my dark blue clutch, which had managed to stay mostly dry during my forced plunge into the fountain. The metallic click echoed sharply in the deathly quiet tent. Every eye from the terrified groom to the horrified society matrons tracked the movement of my hand. I reached inside and retrieved a small, heavy metallic flash drive. I held it up between my thumb and index finger, letting the ambient string lights catch its silver edge. "You called my career obscure computer nonsense, Dad," I said, my voice steady and carrying a lethal chill that cut through the humid ocean air. "You told everyone I was barely scraping by. You assumed because I did not flaunt designer labels or beg for country club memberships that I was a failure. But my firm does not build websites. We secure the digital infrastructure of global financial institutions. We operate in the shadows because our clients require absolute impenetrable discretion." Richard stared at the flash drive as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing against his tight tuxedo collar. "What is that?" he croaked out, his voice raspy and stripped of all its former booming arrogance. "This is your entire corporate life," I replied calmly, dropping my hand back to my lap, but keeping the flash drive firmly in my grip. 3 months ago, my firm was contracted by Vanguard Citadel Partners. They needed a comprehensive top-to-bottom cybersecurity audit prior to a massive portfolio restructuring. Does that name sound familiar to you, Dad? The remaining color drained from Richard's face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a bespoke suit. Vanguard Citadel Partners was the apex predator of private equity. More importantly to my father, they were the exact holding company that had quietly purchased 80% of his corporate debt over the past 2 years. He had been desperately trying to secure a meeting with their board for months, completely unaware that the keys to their kingdom were held by the daughter he was busy publicly humiliating. Your logistics company has been bleeding capital for 36 consecutive months. I continued, projecting my voice just enough so the elite guests at the surrounding tables could hear every devastating detail. You over-leveraged your primary shipping hubs. You took out predatory short-term loans to cover payroll. You drained your operational reserves to throw parties like this one, hoping to trick someone into believing you were solvent. Vanguard Citadel holds 80% of your debt, and they categorized your company as a toxic liability during my audit. That is confidential information, Richard stammered, taking a weak, trembling step toward me. His hands were shaking so violently, he had to press them against his thighs to hide the tremors. You signed non-disclosure agreements. You cannot legally use that information against me. I will have you disbarred or whatever they do to computer consultants. I will sue you for everything you have. I will take this to the authorities and have you thrown in prison. His pathetic attempt at a threat made Harrison let out a low, dark chuckle that sent a shiver down the spines of the closest guests. The sound was entirely devoid of humor, serving only as a grim reminder of the staggering power difference in the room. I am not breaching any confidentiality agreements, Dad, I said, tilting my head slightly. You clearly do not understand how deep my relationship with Vanguard Citadel actually goes. When I identified the catastrophic vulnerabilities in their debt acquisition software, I did not just patch their servers. I saved them from a multi-billion-dollar international breach. The board of directors was extremely grateful. So grateful, in fact, that when they restructured their high-risk assets, they offered my personal holding company an exclusive acquisition opportunity. Richard's eyes widened in pure, unadulterated horror. He was a ruthless businessman, and he knew exactly what the phrase acquisition opportunity meant in this context. The breath hitched in his throat as the walls of his terrible reality closed in on him. I did not just audit your debt. I stated, my voice turning into a quiet, lethal weapon. I purchased it. A collective gasp ripped through the remaining high society guests. The elite crowd suddenly realized they were witnessing a corporate execution in real time. The wealthy socialites who had previously laughed at my wet clothes now looked at me with unvarnished terror. I own 80% of your company, Dad, I explained, watching the absolute devastation crush his final shred of hope. I legally hold the proxy. I control the debt call-ins. I control the liquidation schedules. I control whether your trucks run on Monday morning or whether your entire fleet is seized by federal creditors. You shoved me into a fountain and demanded I pay a $25,000 catering invoice. In return, I am going to foreclose on your entire existence. I can wipe out your legacy with a single phone call. Richard collapsed to his knees. The proud, abusive patriarch of the family fell onto the water-stained wooden floorboards right in front of my chair. He grabbed the edge of the table, his fingers digging into the white linen tablecloth. He was completely trapped. He had no leverage, no money, and no escape. The billionaire he had tried to pitch was my fiercely loyal husband, and the corporate overlords he feared were actually me. The business he had prioritized over his own daughter's physical safety was now entirely in my hands. Before Richard could utter a single word of begging, a frantic movement caught my eye. My mother, Catherine, suddenly snapped out of her paralyzed state. She had watched her husband get completely dismantled. She saw her social standing evaporating before her very eyes. She saw the elite guests whispering and backing toward the exits. Catherine realized that aggressive hostility and gaslighting had failed spectacularly. Her husband was useless on the floor. If she wanted to survive this catastrophic disaster, she needed to pivot immediately. Catherine practically shoved her way past the stunned caterers and rushed toward our table. Her heavy champagne-colored gown dragged across the spilled drinks on the dance floor. She dramatically dropped to her knees right beside Richard, her hands reaching out to clasp mine. I pulled my hands back smoothly, letting her manicured fingers grasp nothing but empty air. "Nina, my sweet, brilliant Nina," Catherine cried, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. The fake tears flowed instantly, perfectly rehearsed for maximum dramatic effect. "You have to forgive us. We had no idea you were carrying such a heavy burden for the family. We are so incredibly proud of you." I stared at the woman who had just 30 minutes ago mocked my dress and complained that I was a selfish burden. The sudden transition from cruel high society matron to weeping loving mother was enough to cause whiplash. She was a master manipulator, desperately trying to rewrite the narrative to position herself as a supportive parent who had simply been misunderstood. "Please," Catherine begged, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. "You are blood, Nina. We are your family. You cannot destroy your own father. You cannot take everything we have worked so hard for. We made some mistakes today. Richard was just stressed about the wedding costs. He loves you. I love you. Family protects family. We can fix this. Just come home with us and we will make everything right. We will give you the respect you deserve. You can sit at the head table. You can introduce your wonderful husband to our friends. We will be a real family again." She reached out again, attempting to grab the edge of my husband's jacket that was draped over my shoulders. Harrison stepped forward instantly, his presence forcing her to retract her hand in fear. Catherine looked up at Harrison, her eyes wide with desperation, hoping the billionaire might somehow intervene and encourage his wife to show mercy to her family. But Harrison just stared down at her with absolute disgust. He was not going to save her. Nobody was going to save her. Catherine was entirely at my mercy, and she knew it. She clasped her hands tightly against her chest, sobbing loudly, and performing the role of the devoted, heartbroken mother for the remaining guests. She was banking on societal pressure and familial guilt to force me into backing down. She had severely miscalculated. I did not feel an ounce of guilt. I only felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. The trap had been fully sprung. My father was ruined and my mother was begging on the floor. But Catherine had opened a dangerous door by bringing up the sacrifices she claimed to have made. She had handed me the exact weapon I needed to finish the job. My father, Richard, finally found his voice. He crawled forward on his hands and knees, completely abandoning any shred of dignity he had left. He looked up at Harrison, his face streaked with sweat and tears. "Mr. Cole, please." He begged, his voice a pathetic broken wheeze. "We will sign whatever you want. We will surrender the logistics firm immediately. Just please do not press criminal charges for the trust fund. Do not send my wife to prison. We will do anything you ask." Harrison did not look at my father. He looked at me. His dark eyes filled with absolute unwavering support. He was waiting for my command. He had promised me total control over my revenge, and he was delivering it flawlessly. I looked down at the two people who had brought me into this world. They had spent 33 years systematically breaking my spirit, hiding my accomplishments, and treating me like a burden. They had stolen my inheritance, shoved me into a freezing fountain, and laughed at my pain. Now they were crawling on the floor at my feet, begging for mercy they absolutely did not deserve. "You want to talk about sacrifices, Mom?" I asked, my voice echoing across the silent tent. "You want to talk about everything you did to raise me?" Catherine nodded frantically, her diamond necklace shaking against her collarbone. "Yes, Nina, we gave you everything. Do you know how hard it was to provide for two daughters in this circle? The pressure to maintain our status, to ensure you both had the right connections. I went without so many things so you could have a roof over your head and food on your plate. I sacrificed my own peace of mind, worrying about your future when you refused to conform. I laid awake at night, praying you would find success. Everything Richard and I did was for you and your sister." She projected her voice, specifically aiming for the wealthy matrons hovering near the exit flaps. She was playing the ultimate martyr card, banking on the universal sympathy afforded to a suffering mother. She wanted the Newport elite to view my corporate takeover as the ungrateful rebellion of a deeply troubled child. I stood up slowly, letting Harrison's jacket drape securely over my shoulders. I stepped around the puddle of fountain water still pooled at my feet and walked directly toward the massive DJ booth situated next to the dance floor. The DJ, a young guy in a sharp vest, froze as I approached. Harrison's lead security operative stepped up right beside me, crossing his massive arms and glaring at the DJ. "Hand me the HDMI cable," I instructed the DJ, my tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. He swallowed hard, his hands shaking as he unplugged the cable from his own laptop and handed it to me. I plugged the cord directly into my phone. Behind the elevated patio, two massive 90-inch LED screens had been set up to display a continuous slideshow of Britney and Preston's flawless engagement photos. I tapped my screen once. The curated images of my sister laughing on a yacht instantly vanished. They were replaced by a stark, high-definition image of a verified bank statement. The logo of a premier national bank glowed brightly, illuminating the dark reception tent. A collective murmur of confusion rolled through the remaining guests. "Let us take a closer look at these sacrifices you made, Mom," I announced, turning back to face her. I pointed to the massive screen. "This is the ledger for the Educational Trust Fund established by Grandma Helen shortly before she passed away. As you can clearly see, the beneficiary listed on this account is Nina Vance. The sole purpose of this trust was to ensure I graduated college without carrying a single dollar of student loan debt." Catherine scrambled to her feet, her face draining of all color. The performative tears instantly dried up, replaced by an expression of raw, unadulterated panic. "Nina, turn that off," she demanded, taking a desperate step toward the DJ booth. "This is private family business. You have no right to display personal financial documents to the public." Harrison's security operative stepped forward, forming an impenetrable wall of muscle between my mother and the screens. She stopped dead in her tracks, physically trembling as the truth loomed over her head. "I have every right to display stolen property, Mom," I stated coldly. I tapped my phone again, moving to the next highlighted document on the screen. For those of you in the back who cannot read the fine print, let me break down the timeline. 5 years ago, when I turned 18, I moved out and began working 3 jobs to pay my university tuition. I took out massive predatory student loans because my parents told me the family logistics company was struggling and they could not spare a dime. They told me I had to pull myself up by my bootstraps to build character. I zoomed in on a specific transaction line, magnifying the numbers until they were impossible to ignore. But exactly 3 weeks after I moved out, this trust fund was completely emptied. $350,000 was wired directly out of my educational account. Since I was only 18, my mother retained her status as the legal trustee. She had the authorization to move the funds, but only if they were applied toward my educational expenses. A lethal silence fell over the tent. Stealing from a trust fund was a felony. Stealing from your own child's trust fund to maintain a facade of wealth was a social crime that the Newport elite simply could not stomach. The wealthy investors and high society matriarchs who had previously judged my wet clothes were now staring at Catherine with absolute undisguised revulsion. "That money was used to pay off family debts!" Catherine shrieked, her voice cracking wildly as she tried to spin another desperate lie. "Your father was facing bankruptcy. We needed that liquidity to keep the logistics firm afloat, so we could continue providing for the family. We were going to pay you back, Nina. I swear we were going to pay it all back with interest once the market stabilized." I shook my head slowly, tapping my phone one final time. "You really should stop lying, Mom. It only makes the forensic audit that much more embarrassing." The image on the massive LED screens shifted. A new document appeared displaying an official real estate wire transfer receipt alongside a signed property deed. The timestamp on the wire transfer perfectly matched the date the trust fund was drained. $350,000 did not go to save the logistics firm. I explained, my voice ringing with total absolute authority. The exact amount stolen from my educational trust was wired directly to a luxury real estate developer in downtown Manhattan. It was used to pay the cash down payment on a sprawling 3-bedroom penthouse apartment. I turned my gaze toward the elevated patio, where Brittany stood frozen in her ruined wedding dress. The penthouse apartment that my younger sister currently lives in. The apartment my parents claimed they bought her as a generous graduation gift. The reaction from the crowd was instantaneous and devastating. Aunt Susan gasped so loudly it echoed across the dance floor. Cousin David, who had been laughing at me earlier, stared at Brittany with pure disgust. The remaining elite guests began actively whispering, pulling out their phones to text their respective social circles. The news of this monumental theft would spread through the high society networks of Rhode Island and Boston before the sun even set. Brittany looked like she was going to be physically sick. She stared at the giant screens reading the property deed that clearly displayed her name right next to the stolen funds. She had spent the last 5 years bragging to all of her wealthy friends about her gorgeous Manhattan penthouse, framing it as proof of her undeniable status as the golden child. Now 300 of her most important peers knew she was living in an apartment funded entirely by her sister's stolen tuition money. Preston the groom finally moved. He took 3 rapid steps away from Brittany, looking at her with absolute horror. He was a man drowning in secret credit card debt, desperately relying on his new wife's supposed family wealth to save him. The sudden realization that his bride was not a wealthy heiress, but a fraudulent beneficiary of stolen funds shattered his entire world. The financial bailout he had banked on was a complete illusion. He had married into a family of broke, desperate thieves. Catherine looked wildly around the room, searching for a single friendly face. She found none. The women she had spent decades trying to impress were turning their backs on her. The country club memberships, the charity gala invitations, the exclusive dinner parties, all of it evaporated in the span of 3 minutes. In the brutal, unforgiving world of high society, there was no coming back from public theft. She was permanently, instantly exiled. "You ruined me!" Catherine wailed, falling back onto her knees on the wet wooden floorboards. She ignored her husband, who was still kneeling a few feet away. She ignored her weeping golden child. She stared at the giant screens clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. "You orchestrated this entire spectacle just to destroy my reputation. You are a monster, Nina. You are a vindictive, hateful monster." I unplugged my phone from the HDMI cable. The massive screens instantly went black, plunging the dance floor back into the dim ambient lighting of the reception tent. I handed the cable back to the terrified DJ and walked slowly toward where my mother kneeled on the floor. Harrison moved with me, his presence a constant, unbreakable shield against any physical retaliation. "I did not ruin you, Mom," I said, looking down at her perfectly styled hair and her expensive champagne-colored gown. "You ruined yourself the day you decided my future was worth less than Brittany's comfort. You ruined yourself the day you looked at the daughter who loved you and saw nothing but a bank account you could plunder. I just brought the receipts." I turned my attention away from my parents and looked directly at the groom. Preston was sweating profusely, his eyes darting frantically toward the exits. He thought the worst of the revelations were over. He thought the destruction of his new in-laws was the grand finale. But I was not finished. The golden child still had a heavy price to pay for her cruelty. I reached back into my dark blue clutch, my fingers wrapping around a thick printed dossier. It was time to show Preston that he was not the only one keeping devastating secrets. Preston Vance had spent the last 20 minutes watching his carefully constructed future evaporate. He had married Brittany entirely for the financial bailout he believed my father could provide. Now that Richard was bankrupt and Catherine was exposed as a common thief, Preston realized he was shackled to a family with absolutely nothing to offer him. But Preston was arrogant. He thought he could salvage some fraction of dignity by playing the protective husband. He thought he could intimidate me into backing down. He took 3 heavy, aggressive strides across the water-stained wooden dance floor, marching directly toward my table. His fists were balled at his sides, his jaw locked in a tight, furious line. "You listen to me, Nina," he growled, his voice dropping into a faux masculine register designed to threaten. "You have done enough damage here today. You are going to pack up your little slideshow, and you are going to leave my wife and my in-laws alone right now." Harrison did not even flinch at the threat. The lead security operative, however, immediately stepped forward, shifting his massive frame to intercept the groom. His hand hovered near his waist, entirely prepared to neutralize Preston before he could take another step. I raised my left hand, calmly waving the operative off. The security guard stopped, instantly obeying my command, but keeping his cold eyes locked onto Preston's chest. I stood up slowly, holding the thick printed dossier in my right hand. "You are in absolutely no position to make demands, Preston," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet, dangerous volume. "In fact, you should probably be thanking me. I just saved you from a lifetime of pretending to be a wealthy senior wealth manager for a family that has no wealth to manage. But since you decided to step into the line of fire, let us talk about your own spectacular illusions." I stepped out from behind the table, closing the distance between us until I was standing just 2 feet away from the furious groom. I tapped the thick manila envelope against the palm of my hand. "Tell me, Preston, how are those frequent business trips to Miami going? The ones you take every other weekend? The ones you told Brittany were absolutely critical for securing high-net-worth clients for your firm?" Preston's face, which had previously been pale with financial panic, suddenly turned a sickening shade of gray. The aggressive posture instantly vanished. His shoulders slumped, and his eyes darted frantically toward the thick folder in my hand. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his voice cracking noticeably. "I am a wealth manager. I travel for client acquisitions. It is a standard part of my job description." I let out a short, dry laugh. "It really is incredible how easily you all lie. But like I told my mother earlier today, I always bring the receipts." I opened the envelope and pulled out a stack of high-definition glossy photographs. I did not project these onto the massive screens. I did not need to. I simply handed the stack directly to Brittany, who had slowly walked up behind her new husband. Brittany looked down at the photographs. Her eyes widened in absolute horror. The top image showed Preston lounging on the deck of a rented luxury yacht in South Beach. He was not wearing a business suit, and he was not meeting with corporate clients. He was wearing expensive designer swim trunks, and he had his arm wrapped tightly around a beautiful blonde woman in her early 20s. The next photograph showed Preston and the same blonde woman sitting at a candlelit table at a five-star restaurant in Miami. The third showed them walking hand in hand out of a high-end luxury boutique, carrying shopping bags from brands that cost thousands of dollars per item. The final photograph was a screenshot of a signed residential lease agreement for a luxury condominium in downtown Miami. The lease was signed by Preston Vance. The listed occupant was a woman named Chloe. "You do not travel to Miami for client acquisitions," Preston, I announced, ensuring my voice carried to the few remaining society guests who were lingering near the exits, absolutely captivated by the unfolding drama. "You travel to Miami to maintain a completely separate secret second life. You have been funding an entirely separate household for a 22-year-old model named Chloe for the past 14 months. You pay her rent, you buy her designer clothes, you fund her yacht rentals and her luxury vacations." Brittany let out a sound that was half gasp and half scream. She dropped the photographs onto the wet floorboards, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. Preston spun around trying to grab the photos, but it was entirely too late. The damage was permanently done. "That is where the credit card debt came from," I continued, relentlessly twisting the knife. "You did not just max out 3 hidden credit accounts to buy Brittany's engagement ring. You maxed them out to maintain a sugar baby in Florida while simultaneously courting a supposed heiress in Rhode Island. You were running a massive financial Ponzi scheme with your own personal life. You were praying that my father's money would bail you out before the credit card companies sued you for insolvency and before Chloe realized you were completely broke." Preston raised his hands in a frantic defensive gesture, trying to physically block out my words. "Brittany, please," he begged, his voice hitting a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "It is not what it looks like. Those photos are taken out of context. She is just a client. I swear to you, she is just a high-risk client I was trying to land for the firm. She is a client who lives in an apartment you leased under your own name," I countered sharply, stepping closer to him. "She is a client you kiss on luxury yachts. She is a client you have been wiring $10,000 a month to from a shadow bank account. I ran the trace on the routing numbers, Preston. I have the entire digital paper trail. Do you want me to read the text messages you sent her last night while you were at your rehearsal dinner?" The ones where you promised her you were only marrying Brittany for the corporate connections. Brittany absolutely snapped. The destruction of her perfect wedding, the revelation that her family was broke, and the devastating public humiliation of her mother's theft had already pushed her to the absolute brink of insanity. The undeniable proof that her handsome, wealthy groom was actually a broke, cheating fraud shattered whatever fragile sanity she had left. She let out a piercing, completely unhinged scream that echoed across the entire estate. "You promised me!" she shrieked, her voice tearing at her vocal cords. "You told me I was the only one. You told me we were going to build an empire together. You pathetic, broke, cheating loser." Brittany launched herself at Preston. She did not slap him. She curled her manicured fingers into claws and physically attacked him. She grabbed the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo, ripping the expensive silk fabric with a violent, aggressive yank. Preston stumbled backward, tripping over the wet hem of her massive wedding dress. They both went crashing down onto the slippery wooden floorboards of the dance floor, right in the middle of the spilled champagne and ruined floral arrangements. Preston scrambled desperately, trying to shield his face from his new wife's furious assault. "Brittany, get off me!" he yelled, trying to push her heavy gown away. "You are acting crazy. Stop it right now. I gave you everything." Brittany screamed, thrashing wildly against him. "I let you marry into my family. I let you stand up there and pretend you were worthy of me. I hate you. I absolutely hate you." The perfect high society wedding officially devolved into a vicious public brawl. Preston managed to shove Brittany off his chest, but his violent push sent her sliding across the wet floor. Her pristine white gown soaked up the muddy water from the crushed lawn, and the spilled drinks turning the expensive fabric into a heavy gray mess. She scrambled back to her feet, grabbing a heavy silver serving tray from the nearest table and hurling it directly at Preston's head. He ducked just in time, the tray crashing into a towering glass centerpiece and sending shards of crystal raining down across the dance floor. My mother, Catherine, shrieked in horror, trying to intervene to save whatever shred of dignity the family had left. She grabbed Brittany's arm, pleading with her to stop, but Brittany wildly shoved her own mother away. "Do not touch me," Brittany screamed at Catherine. "This is all your fault. You told me he was rich. You told me he was a perfect match. You ruined my life." My father Richard stood completely paralyzed by the utter devastation of his entire world. His business was gone. His social standing was eradicated. His wife was exposed as a thief, and his golden child was actively destroying her groom in a physical street fight in the middle of a Newport estate. He did not move to stop the violence. He simply stared blankly at the destruction, a broken, ruined man. The last remaining elite guests scrambled frantically for the exits, completely abandoning their expensive coats and gifts in their desperation to flee the toxic disaster zone. The caterers abandoned their stations, leaving trays of expensive food to rot in the coastal humidity. Harrison stood calmly beside me, his protective presence an unshakable anchor in the midst of the total chaos. He wrapped his arm securely around my waist, pulling me slightly back to ensure none of the flying glass or thrashing limbs came anywhere near us. We stood together in the dark corner of the ruined reception tent, watching the absolute carnage unfold. I did not feel an ounce of pity for the people tearing each other apart on the floor. I simply watched the flames of their own deception consume them entirely. The truth had finally been unleashed, and it was burning their perfect illusion to the ground. The spectacle of the bride and groom physically tearing each other apart on the waterlogged dance floor was the final catalyst. For the first 20 minutes of my arrival, the 300 guests had remained trapped in a state of morbid fascination. They were the apex predators of Newport society, including venture capitalists, corporate board members, and generational trust fund heirs. They thrived on scandal as long as the scandal did not threaten their own bottom lines. But the atmosphere inside the tent had fundamentally and irrevocably shifted. The entertainment had rapidly morphed into acute financial danger. I watched the realization ripple through the crowd like a synchronized wave. These were people who held board seats on companies heavily subsidized by Harrison's venture capital firm. They managed portfolios that relied entirely on the market stability my husband dictated. They suddenly understood that standing in this tent, breathing the same air as Richard and Catherine, was a direct threat to their own survival. They had just watched my parents violently assault and verbally abuse the wife of the man who controlled their collective financial destinies. Guilt by association was a very real concept in high society. The exodus began quietly, but with absolute ruthless efficiency. It started with Arthur Sterling, a billionaire real estate developer, whose firm frequently partnered with Harrison's. Sterling did not say a word to my parents. He simply buttoned his bespoke suit jacket, placed his crystal champagne flute on a passing tray, and gestured for his wife to follow him. He walked deliberately out of the main tent entrance, making a point to catch Harrison's eye and deliver a sharp, respectful nod of solidarity before disappearing into the evening air. That single nod broke the dam. The mass evacuation commenced immediately. The elite crowd moved as one unified entity driven by the primal urge to distance themselves from a sinking ship. Women in custom silk gowns abandoned their expensive designer clutch purses on the tables, moving briskly toward the valet stand without looking back. Men pulled their wives by the elbows, marching past my groveling father as if he were completely invisible. Richard scrambled to his feet, his knees soaked from the muddy floorboards. He frantically threw himself into the path of a departing bank executive, practically begging him to stay. "Please, Robert," my father pleaded, grabbing the man's arm. "This is just a temporary family dispute. We are cutting the cake in 10 minutes. The executive violently yanked his arm out of Richard's grasp, looking at my father with an expression of pure, unfiltered disgust. "Do not ever contact my office again," Richard the executive hissed before turning his back on my father forever. Catherine was faring no better. She had crawled off the floor and was desperately trying to block the exit path of the high society matrons she had spent her entire life trying to impress. She reached out to a woman named Beatrice who sat on the board of the most prestigious country club in Rhode Island. "Beatrice," my mother sobbed, reaching for the woman's diamond-adorned wrist. "You know me. You know I would never steal. Nina is just a vindictive liar. Please do not leave. We have the lobster service coming out next." Beatrice stopped and looked my mother slowly up and down. Her gaze was colder than the water in the stone fountain. "You emptied your own daughter's college fund to buy a penthouse." "Catherine," Beatrice stated, her voice carrying clearly over the sound of the retreating crowd, "you are a common thief wearing a stolen dress. You will be removed from the club registry by Monday morning." Beatrice stepped around my mother, leaving Catherine gasping for air as the devastating reality of her permanent social exile finally cemented itself in her mind. The entire foundation of her existence, her country club status, her charity galas, her wealthy friends vanished into thin air in less than 60 seconds. As the elite guests practically sprinted for the safety of their luxury vehicles, the secondary layer of the reception began to actively collapse. The catering captain, a seasoned professional who had managed hundreds of high-end Newport weddings, had been quietly observing the total destruction of the host family. He had heard the undeniable revelation that my father was completely bankrupt, and that the entire wedding was funded by maxed-out credit cards and stolen trust money. He knew a defaulted invoice when he saw one. He did not wait for Richard to give an order. The captain blew a short, sharp whistle commanding the immediate attention of his 50-person waitstaff. "Strike the buffets," the captain barked, his voice loud and authoritative. "Pack up the silver and load the trucks immediately. Do not serve another drop of alcohol. We are leaving right now." The catering staff moved with terrifying speed. They snatched half-empty champagne flutes directly out of the hands of the few remaining stragglers. They aggressively wheeled away the towering tiers of imported seafood and expensive caviar, dumping the food unceremoniously into heavy plastic trash bins to expedite the cleanup. They stripped the white linen tablecloths right off the tables, sending expensive floral arrangements crashing to the wooden floorboards. The 12-piece string quartet, seeing the mass exodus, packed their expensive instruments into their velvet-lined cases and slipped out the back exit of the tent without playing a single departing note. The systematic, rapid deconstruction of the $150,000 wedding was a masterclass in brutal efficiency. In less than 10 minutes, the vibrant, crowded reception tent was completely stripped bare. The towering heat lamps were shut off instantly, dropping the ambient temperature of the room. The temporary bar was dismantled, leaving behind nothing but empty ice buckets and discarded napkins. The caterers loaded the last of their equipment into their box trucks, shutting the heavy metal doors with a loud echoing slam that signaled the absolute end of the event. The trucks aggressively rolled out of the estate, leaving deep muddy tire tracks across the manicured grass. The silence that followed the mass departure was deafening. The grand white tent, which had been specifically designed to accommodate 300 cheering guests, was now entirely empty. It felt like a massive hollow cavern stripped of all its warmth and life. The coastal wind whipped through the open canvas flaps, rattling the skeletal remains of the tables and blowing discarded cocktail napkins across the empty dance floor. I stood securely by Harrison's side, watching the absolute desolation of my family. The physical ruins of the reception perfectly mirrored the financial and social ruins of the family, standing in the center of the room. The polished wooden dance floor was heavily scarred, covered in muddy footprints, shattered crystal glasses, and puddles of spilled red wine that looked like dried blood in the dim lighting. The towering six-tier wedding cake, an extravagant masterpiece of spun sugar and white fondant, stood completely abandoned and untouched, leaning dangerously to one side after a caterer had bumped the table during their frantic exit. Brittany and Preston had finally stopped physically fighting. They lay exhausted and bruised on the floor amidst the broken glass and crushed flower petals. Brittany's custom designer gown was completely destroyed, ripped at the seams, and stained with mud. She stared blankly up at the canvas ceiling of the tent, her perfect makeup running down her face in thick black tracks of mascara. Preston sat a few feet away from her, his expensive tuxedo jacket torn and his face scratched. He buried his head in his hands, the crushing weight of his exposed double life and his impending financial ruin completely paralyzing him. They were tied to each other now, two broke, fraudulent liars trapped in a marriage built entirely on deception and debt. My mother, Catherine, sat alone on a flipped-over catering chair. She looked like a ghost, her eyes wide and vacant. She was entirely stripped of her power and her pride. She had spent her entire adult life curating an image of absolute perfection, stepping on anyone and everyone to climb the social ladder. She had eagerly sacrificed her eldest daughter's mental and financial well-being just to maintain a superficial facade. Now she had nothing. No friends, no status, no money, and absolutely no future in the circles she desperately craved. She slowly reached up and unclasped the heavy diamond necklace from her throat, letting the expensive jewelry drop carelessly onto the wet floor, as if the weight of it was suddenly too much to bear. The total isolation of the moment was profound. There was no one left to perform for. There were no photographers to capture forced smiles. There were no society matrons to impress with fake wealth. There was only the brutal, unavoidable reality of their own catastrophic failures. I watched them sit in the wreckage of their own making, feeling absolutely no remorse. I had not caused this destruction. I had merely held up a mirror and forced them to look at their true reflections. They had built their entire empire on a foundation of sand, and the tide had finally rushed in to wash it all away. My father, Richard, stood entirely alone in the center of the ruined dance floor. His hands hung limply at his sides, his posture completely broken. He looked around the empty cavernous tent, staring at the abandoned tables and the crushed floral centerpieces. He listened to the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the nearby cliffs, a stark reminder that the world outside this tent was continuing to move forward without him. He had lost his guests. He had lost his social dignity. He had definitively lost his logistics firm and his entire professional career. He had been stripped of every single thing that gave him power and authority in this world. He slowly turned his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto me where I stood safely wrapped in my husband's jacket. The shock and panic that had previously paralyzed him slowly morphed into something much darker and far more dangerous. He could not accept that his own arrogant actions had caused this outcome. His deeply narcissistic mind desperately needed a familiar scapegoat to blame for his total unrecoverable annihilation. He glared at me, his fists clenching so tightly, his knuckles turned a stark bone white. The brutal realization that the daughter he had abused for decades was the sole architect of his financial execution finally snapped the last remaining thread of his fragile sanity. He took a heavy, aggressive step forward, kicking a broken crystal champagne flute out of his path. His chest heaved with violent, unhinged rage as he prepared to launch his final, desperate attack. The ultimate confrontation was now completely unavoidable, and I stood perfectly still, absolutely ready to face it. Richard let out a guttural roar that tore from the deepest part of his chest. It was not the sound of a rational human being. It was the sound of a cornered animal realizing it was about to be slaughtered. He lunged forward, his expensive patent leather dress shoes slipping slightly on the champagne-soaked wood, but he caught his balance and charged directly at me. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He pointed a trembling, aggressive finger at my face, screaming with such force that veins bulged visibly against his neck. "You destroyed this family!" he bellowed, his voice echoing violently through the empty, cavernous tent. "You came here just to humiliate us. You have always been a jealous, spiteful burden. I gave you a roof over your head. I gave you my name, and you repay me by destroying my company and ruining your sister's perfect day. You are a monster. You are dead to me. Do you hear me? Dead." Harrison did not flinch. He did not step in front of me to shield me because he knew I did not need shielding. He simply gave a sharp, precise nod to his lead security operative. The massive guard stepped fluidly into Richard's path. My father, completely blinded by his own narcissistic rage, attempted to shove the operative aside just as he had shoved me at the fountain. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The operative did not yield a single inch. Instead, he caught Richard's extended wrist, twisting it sharply downward in a tactical compliance hold that forced my father to immediately drop to one knee to avoid having his arm snapped in half. Richard gasped in sudden, sharp pain. "Let go of me," he commanded, still attempting to utilize his fake, booming corporate authority. "I am the host of this event. You are trespassing on my rented property. I will have you arrested for assault." The sheer irony of his statement hung heavily in the cold ocean air. He was actively threatening to call the authorities for a defensive hold entirely, forgetting that he had aggressively pushed his own daughter into a stone basin less than an hour prior. He truly believed the laws of physics and society did not apply to him. But the law had already arrived. Before Richard could demand his release a second time, the canvas flaps at the main entrance of the reception tent were violently thrown open. The sharp, piercing wail of police sirens had been masked by the crashing ocean waves and the residual ringing in our ears, but the flashing red and blue strobe lights were impossible to ignore. They bounced aggressively against the white fabric of the tent, casting chaotic, rotating shadows across the ruined dance floor. 4 uniformed police officers from the Newport Police Department marched into the venue. They moved with absolute, uncompromising authority, their hands resting cautiously on their utility belts as they quickly assessed the wreckage of the high society wedding. They bypassed the shattered crystal and the overturned chairs, making a direct line for the back corner of the tent where we stood. Richard, still pinned on one knee by the security operative, looked up at the approaching officers. A brief, delusional flash of triumph crossed his sweaty face. He actually believed the police had arrived to rescue him from Harrison's private security detail. Officer Richard shouted, his voice cracking with desperate relief. "Thank God you are here. These men are trespassing. They are holding me hostage at my own daughter's wedding. I demand you arrest them immediately." The lead police officer, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, did not even look at my father. He walked straight past the kneeling patriarch and stopped directly in front of Harrison. The officer offered a short, respectful nod. "Mr. Cole," the officer stated calmly, "we received the dispatch from your security director regarding an unprovoked physical assault on the premises. We secured the perimeter and have units stationed at the main gates." Richard froze. The delusional triumph evaporated from his face, replaced by a sudden, chilling dread. He looked from the police officer to Harrison, his brain desperately trying to calculate the absolute nightmare unfolding before him. My security director contacted the Newport authorities 35 minutes ago. Harrison explained, his voice, a low, lethal rumble that commanded the absolute attention of everyone in the room. He provided them with the high-definition surveillance footage captured by my detail's advanced reconnaissance drones. We also provided the sworn eyewitness statements from 3 catering staff members who watched a grown man violently shove his daughter into a stone fountain. The lead officer finally looked down at my father. "Richard Vance." The officer said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. "You are being placed under arrest for domestic battery and assault." The words struck Richard like a physical execution. The operative released his compliance hold, allowing my father to stagger backward, but 2 police officers immediately stepped forward to take his place. They grabbed Richard's arms forcefully, turning him around to face the torn, ruined canvas of the tent wall. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting closed around Richard's wrists echoed through the silent venue. "No," Richard gasped, his voice suddenly weak and trembling. "No, you cannot do this. You do not understand. I am a respected businessman. I am the CEO of a major logistics firm. I know the mayor. I play golf with the chief of police. This is a private family matter. She is my daughter. It was just a misunderstanding." "You can explain that misunderstanding to the judge," the officer replied coldly, tightening the handcuffs. "You are legally required to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The Miranda rights were being read to a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. He was wearing a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than the officer's monthly salary, standing in a venue that cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to rent, and he was being hauled away like a common criminal. The absolute destruction of his pride was total and irreversible. Catherine, who had been sitting paralyzed on a flipped-over catering chair, suddenly snapped out of her catatonic state. Seeing her husband in metal handcuffs, seeing the flashing police lights reflecting off the muddy dance floor, finally broke the last remaining barrier of her fragile reality. Her entire world, her country club status, her wealth, her illusion of perfection, was completely gone. Now her husband was going to a holding cell, guaranteeing their faces would be splashed across the local police blotters and social gossip columns by morning. She scrambled off the chair, her heavy champagne-colored gown tangling around her legs. She crawled across the wet, sticky floorboards, completely abandoning any remaining shred of her high society dignity. She threw herself at my feet, her hands desperately grabbing the hem of my ruined blue dress. "Nina, please!" Catherine wailed, her voice a shrill, hysterical shriek that tore through the cold night air. "You cannot let them do this. You cannot send your father to jail. He will not survive it. The scandal will ruin us permanently. We will lose everything. Please, I am begging you. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you tripped. Tell them you do not want to press charges." Richard, seeing his wife groveling on the floor, completely abandoned his arrogant defiance. The reality of the cold steel around his wrist shattered his ego. He dropped heavily onto his knees right beside Catherine, ignoring the rough tug of the police officers trying to keep him standing. He looked up at me, tears streaming down his flushed, sweaty face. His booming voice was reduced to a pathetic, whimpering sob. "Nina, my sweet girl," Richard pleaded, his face contorted in absolute desperation. "I am sorry. I am so incredibly sorry. I lost my mind. The financial pressure the wedding costs, the stress of the business, it broke me. I never meant to hurt you. I love you. You are my daughter. Please have mercy. I will do whatever you want. I will sign the company over to you right now. Just tell the officers to let me go. I am begging you. Do not destroy my life." I looked at my mother, whose makeup was running down her face in thick, dark streaks, ruining her expensive aesthetic. I looked at my father, a broken, bankrupt man in handcuffs, begging for his freedom from the daughter he had called a worthless burden. The juxtaposition of their current pathetic state against the arrogant cruelty they had displayed just an hour ago was staggering. They had spent decades building a fortress of lies, constructing a reality where they were untouchable royalty, and I was merely a peasant allowed to exist in their shadow. The police sirens wailing outside the tent were the trumpets announcing the fall of their kingdom. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel pity. I felt absolute crystal clear liberation. The heavy chains of obligation, guilt, and trauma that they had meticulously wrapped around my neck for 33 years were completely severed. I was no longer the scapegoat they could manipulate. I was no longer the punching bag they could use to vent their financial frustrations. I was the architect of my own life, and I was standing on top of the empire they had actively tried to destroy. The power they thought they held over me was nothing but a fragile illusion, and I had just shattered it into a million irreparable pieces. I slowly pulled the hem of my wet dress out of my mother's desperate, clawing grasp. The wet fabric slipped easily from her fingers. I stepped back, aligning myself perfectly with Harrison, feeling the warm, solid reassurance of his presence beside me. His security team remained vigilant, forming an impenetrable barrier between my new family and my old one. I looked down at my weeping, broken parents, my face a mask of absolute chilling resolve. I was ready to deliver the final lethal blow to their non-existent empire, to finalize the absolute boundary between my future and their consequences. The lead officer stood tall beside my kneeling father. The flashing red and blue lights from the squad cars parked on the crushed lawn illuminated the stark metal of the handcuffs binding Richard's wrists. The officer turned his attention away from the whimpering broken man on the floor and focused entirely on me. His expression was professional, but carried a clear undercurrent of respect for the sheer magnitude of the situation. "Ma'am," the officer said, his deep voice cutting through the sounds of my mother's hysterical sobbing. "We have the video evidence and the witness statements to secure a felony battery charge tonight. We can transport him to the precinct immediately. I just need you to confirm on the record if you wish to press formal charges for the assault." The question hung heavily in the freezing coastal air. My father snapped his head up to look at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, his face slick with sweat and tears. He was wearing an incredibly expensive custom-tailored tuxedo that was now stained with mud and champagne, but the pristine tailoring could not hide the pathetic, desperate reality of his current state. He was a man waiting for the executioner's axe to fall. "Nina, please," Richard begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, pathetic whine. "I am begging you. Do not let them take me in the back of a squad car. I will not survive the holding cell. The shame will literally kill me. I will sign anything you want. I will give you whatever you demand. Just please tell the officer to take these handcuffs off." Catherine crawled forward again, her ruined champagne-colored gown dragging across the sticky floorboards. She reached out toward me but stopped herself before making physical contact, clearly terrified of Harrison's security team. She clasped her hands together in a posture of desperate prayer. "She is your family, Nina!" Catherine wailed, her chest heaving with violent sobs. "He is your father. You cannot put your own flesh and blood behind bars. Think of the public humiliation. Think of the permanent damage to the family name. We have already lost the business and the country club. Do not take his freedom too. Have a little mercy for the people who raised you." I looked down at the two of them. I felt the cold ocean wind whip my wet hair across my face, but I did not shiver. I stood perfectly still, anchoring myself in the absolute power of the moment. I stared at the man who had violently shoved me into a stone fountain simply because I refused to pay for a party I did not throw. I stared at the woman who had stolen my educational trust fund to buy a penthouse for her favorite child. They were begging for mercy, using the word family as a shield to protect themselves from the consequences of their own monstrous actions. They believed that because we shared genetics, I was inherently obligated to save them from their own destruction. They thought the biological tie between us was a magical tether they could yank whenever they needed a bailout. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing minute. I let them suffer in the agonizing uncertainty of their fate. I watched them tremble under the flashing police lights, feeling the crushing weight of their total vulnerability. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of absolute liberation. The invisible chains they had wrapped around my neck for 33 years were finally rusting away into nothing. I turned my gaze away from my weeping parents and looked directly at the lead police officer. I took a slow, deliberate breath, filling my lungs with the crisp ocean air. "Officer," I said, my voice projecting with crystal clear authority across the ruined reception tent. "I appreciate your swift response and your diligence. However, I do not wish to press formal charges tonight." A collective shudder of massive, overwhelming relief ripped through my parents. Richard let out a loud, gasping sob, dropping his chin to his chest as the immediate threat of a jail cell evaporated. Catherine collapsed backward onto her heels, closing her eyes and whispering frantic words of gratitude. They actually believed they had won. They genuinely thought their desperate emotional manipulation had successfully broken through my defenses. They thought the old, compliant Nina, the obedient scapegoat, had finally resurfaced to protect the precious family image. They were spectacularly wrong. I did not do this out of mercy. I did not do this out of some misguided sense of familial loyalty. I did it because a jail cell was an incredibly easy escape route. If I sent Richard to prison, he would automatically become a martyr in his own twisted mind. He would spend the next 5 years sitting in a cell telling anyone who would listen that he was the tragic victim of a vindictive, ungrateful daughter. He would use the incarceration to completely avoid the crushing daily reality of his financial collapse. I was not going to give him the luxury of a convenient narrative. I was going to force him to live in the wreckage of the empire he had destroyed. The police officer looked at me with a mild expression of surprise, but he remained entirely professional. "Are you absolutely certain, ma'am?" he asked gently, ensuring I was not being coerced. "You have irrefutable evidence of the assault." "I am completely certain," I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight. The officer nodded once. He reached down and grabbed Richard's arm, hauling the heavy, sweating man up from the floorboards. The officer pulled a small silver key from his utility belt and inserted it into the handcuffs. The sharp metallic click of the locks releasing echoed through the silent tent. The heavy steel cuffs dropped away from Richard's wrists. My father rubbed his raw skin, gasping for air, as if he had just run a marathon. He looked up at me, a tentative, hopeful smile trembling on his lips. "Thank you, Nina," he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. "Thank you so much. I promise you I will make this right. I will prove to you that we can be a real family again. We will fix this." I stepped forward, closing the distance between us, until I was standing just 2 feet away from his exhausted, sweating face. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a lethal, chilling intensity that froze the hopeful smile right off his lips. "You stopped being my family the moment you pushed me in the water," I stated loudly, ensuring every single word carved itself permanently into his memory. "I am not sending you to jail. I am just foreclosing on your entire life." The words struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The pathetic, fragile hope that had just bloomed in his chest was instantly, violently eradicated. He staggered backward, his mouth dropping open in absolute horror, as the true magnitude of my decision finally registered in his panicking brain. "A jail cell provides 3 meals a day and a bed to sleep on. Dad." I continued, my tone devoid of any human warmth. "A jail cell gives you an excuse to hide from your creditors and your furious high society friends. I am not giving you a place to hide. I am leaving you out here in the open to face the total catastrophic ruin you created." I turned my cold gaze to my mother, who was still sitting on the wet floor, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She suddenly understood that avoiding a police record did not save her social standing or her bank accounts. It simply meant she had to watch her luxurious life slowly, painfully burn to ashes without any protective shelter. "You stole my education fund to buy a penthouse for the daughter who mocked me," I said, speaking directly to Catherine. "You actively plotted to steal my grandmother's inheritance because you thought I was a pathetic failure who threw my life away. You used my name as a punchline to impress people who just sprinted for their cars the moment they realized you were completely broke. I am not pressing charges because the criminal justice system is entirely too lenient for what you have done. The financial justice system, however, is absolutely ruthless. I looked back at Richard, watching the crushing reality of his impending liquidation settle over his features. By Monday morning, the holding company I control will officially call in the entirety of your corporate debt. We will seize your fleet. We will lock the doors to your warehouses. We will freeze your operational accounts. Your logistics firm will be completely dissolved, and your personal assets will be liquidated to cover the aggressive margins. Nina, please do not do this, Richard begged, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. I have spent 30 years building that company. It is my entire legacy. You cannot take my life's work. You did not build a legacy, I corrected sharply, my voice echoing through the empty cavernous space. You built a fraudulent house of cards funded by predatory loans and stolen trust money. You abused the people who could have helped you, and you worshiped the people who abandoned you at the first sign of trouble. I am not taking your life's work. I am simply letting the gravity of your own terrible decisions crush you. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, aligning myself perfectly with Harrison once again. My husband placed his hand securely on the small of my back, a silent gesture of absolute, unwavering solidarity. His security team remained highly vigilant, their eyes scanning the ruined dance floor to ensure no one made a sudden, desperate move. This is the absolute end of our association, I announced, my voice carrying a profound, unshakable finality. This is the ironclad boundary. You will never contact me again. You will not call. You will not text. You will not attempt to send a letter through your lawyers. If you approach my home or my office, I will have you arrested for trespassing and harassment. You are entirely erased from my existence. I glanced over at the shattered glass and crushed flowers where Brittany and Preston were still sitting in stunned silence. The bride and groom were trapped in the wreckage of their own fraudulent marriage, staring at the destruction of their supposed financial safety net. That applies to you two as well, I added, my tone equally lethal. Enjoy the Miami apartment, Preston. Enjoy the stolen penthouse, Brittany. Try not to destroy each other before the creditors show up to repossess the furniture. The absolute boundary was set. There was no room for negotiation. There was no space for fake apologies or future reconciliation. I had drawn a thick, permanent line in the sand, separating my peaceful, successful future from their toxic, catastrophic present. I had given them exactly what they asked for all those years ago. I was completely removing myself from their lives. The only difference was that this time I was taking all the power, all the money, and all the dignity with me. I looked at my family one last time. They were broken, weeping, and utterly ruined, standing in the middle of a destroyed reception tent that they could not afford to pay for. They had tried to drown me in their cruelty, but they had only succeeded in drowning themselves. I felt a deep, powerful sense of closure wash over my spirit. The trauma of my childhood, the pain of their constant rejection, the sting of their public humiliation, it all finally dissolved into the cold ocean wind. I was completely free. The lead police officer looked at me, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his stern features. Are you absolutely certain, ma'am, you have irrefutable evidence of the assault? We can take him in right now. I am completely certain, I replied, keeping my posture perfectly straight and my voice unwavering. I do not want to press formal charges. The officer nodded once, his expression carefully neutral. He reached down, grabbed my father's arm, and hauled the heavy, sweating man up from the floorboards. The officer pulled a small silver key from his utility belt, inserting it into the handcuffs. The sharp, metallic click of the locks releasing echoed through the silent tent. The heavy steel cuffs dropped away from Richard's wrists. My father rubbed his raw skin, gasping for air, as if he had just surfaced from drowning. He looked up at me, a tentative, desperate, hopeful smile trembling on his lips. Thank you, Nina, he whispered, his voice hoarse and broken. Thank you so much. I promise you I will make this right. I will prove to you that we can be a real family again. We will fix this. I stepped forward, closing the distance between us until I was standing just 2 feet away from his exhausted, sweating face. I did not raise my voice, but I spoke with a lethal, chilling intensity that froze the hopeful smile right off his lips. You stopped being my family the moment you pushed me in the water. I stated loudly, ensuring every single word carved itself permanently into his memory. I am not sending you to jail. I am just foreclosing on your entire life. The words struck him with the devastating force of a physical blow. The pathetic, fragile hope that had just bloomed in his chest was instantly violently eradicated. He staggered backward, his mouth dropping open in absolute horror as the true magnitude of my decision finally registered in his panicking brain. A jail cell provides 3 meals a day and a bed to sleep on, Dad. I continued, my tone devoid of any human warmth. A jail cell gives you an excuse to hide from your creditors and your furious high society friends. I am not giving you a place to hide. I am leaving you out here in the open to face the total catastrophic ruin you created. I turned my cold gaze to my mother, who was still sitting on the wet floor, staring up at me with wide, terrified eyes. She suddenly understood that avoiding a police record did not save her social standing or her bank accounts. It simply meant she had to watch her luxurious life slowly, painfully burn to ashes without any protective shelter. You stole my education fund to buy a penthouse for the daughter who mocked me, I said, speaking directly to Catherine. You actively plotted to steal my grandmother's inheritance because you thought I was a pathetic failure who threw my life away. You used my name as a punchline to impress people who just sprinted for their cars the moment they realized you were completely broke. I am not pressing charges because the criminal justice system is entirely too lenient for what you have done. The financial justice system, however, is absolutely ruthless. I looked back at Richard, watching the crushing reality of his impending liquidation settle over his features. By Monday morning, the holding company I control will officially call in the entirety of your corporate debt. We will seize your fleet. We will lock the doors to your warehouses. We will freeze your operational accounts. Your logistics firm will be completely dissolved, and your personal assets will be liquidated to cover the aggressive margins. Nina, please do not do this, Richard begged, reaching a trembling hand out toward me. I have spent 30 years building that company. It is my entire legacy. You cannot take my life's work. You did not build a legacy, I corrected sharply, my voice echoing through the empty, cavernous space. You built a fraudulent house of cards funded by predatory loans and stolen trust money. You abused the people who could have helped you, and you worshipped the people who abandoned you at the first sign of trouble. I am not taking your life's work. I am simply letting the gravity of your own terrible decisions crush you. From the shadows just beyond the tent's entrance, a man in a pristine, tailored suit stepped forward. He had emerged from one of the black SUVs that had breached the lawn earlier. This was Harrison's lead attorney, a man known in financial circles for his surgical precision in dismantling hostile corporate entities. He carried a thick, sealed manila envelope. He walked past the police officers, his gaze fixed on my father. He stopped in front of Richard, holding the envelope out. Mr. Vance, the attorney said, his voice clipped and professional. This is the formal legal notice of immediate debt call-in from Vanguard Citadel Partners. Consider yourself served. Your company will be in receivership by Monday morning at 8 a.m. Richard stared at the envelope as if it were a bomb. He did not reach for it. The attorney simply let go, and the heavy envelope dropped onto the wet floorboards at Richard's feet with a dull thud. The silence that followed was absolute. The estate was dead quiet save for the sound of the ocean waves crashing against the nearby cliffs. The rhythmic thumping of the helicopter's idling rotors seemed to emphasize the finality of the moment. Brittany was still weeping on the floor, her ruined wedding dress spread around her like a dirty, deflated parachute. Preston sat nearby, staring blankly ahead, realizing that his own fraudulent house of cards had collapsed alongside his new in-laws. Catherine remained paralyzed, her eyes darting frantically between the manila envelope and my unyielding expression. Richard stood frozen, staring down at the paperwork that officially ended his career and his meticulously crafted facade of wealth. His hands hung limply at his sides. The booming, arrogant patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a hollow shell of a man. I stood perfectly still, anchored by the warm, solid presence of my husband beside me. I did not gloat. I did not scream or hurl insults. I did not need to. My absolute silence and unwavering poise provided the ultimate contrast to their pathetic, hysterical collapse. This was true power, not volume, not aggression, but the quiet, undeniable execution of consequences. I had dismantled their empire without raising a single finger, and my silence cemented my ultimate victory. Harrison shifted his weight, his movement deliberate and grounding. He did not say a word to the broken people scattered across the ruined dance floor. He simply reached down and interlaced his fingers with mine. His grip was warm and fiercely protective, a tangible anchor in the midst of the absolute devastation we had just unleashed. I squeezed his hand in return, a silent signal that my business here was officially concluded. There was nothing left to say, and there was absolutely nothing left to salvage. Without another glance at my father, who remained frozen with the legal notice of his imminent financial ruin clutched in his trembling hands, we turned our backs on the wreckage. We walked away from the shattered crystal, the crushed floral arrangements, and the suffocating arrogance that had defined my entire existence within that family. Behind us, the reality of the situation rapidly descended upon the estate. The lead police officer began aggressively questioning Richard, not just about the assault, but about the frantic catering captain who had suddenly sprinted back into the tent, loudly demanding immediate cash payment for the abandoned luxury buffet. Catherine let out a fresh, high-pitched wail as two other officers approached her to take a formal statement regarding the physical altercation between the bride and groom. Brittany and Preston remained trapped in the center of the chaotic scene, surrounded by law enforcement and furious unpaid vendors. Their fraudulent fairy tale had completely imploded, leaving them bound to each other in a nightmare of inescapable debt and public humiliation. I did not turn around to watch the police separate my sister and her fraudulent husband. I kept my eyes focused entirely on the path ahead. The heavy matte black Sikorsky helicopter waited on the private helipad, its rotors spinning with a low, powerful hum that drowned out the frantic screaming coming from the reception tent. The security operatives flanked us smoothly, forming an impenetrable moving barricade that shielded us from the chaotic aftermath. As we reached the helicopter, Harrison placed his hand gently on the small of my back, guiding me up the metal steps and into the luxurious soundproofed cabin. The heavy door slid shut behind us, with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly cutting off the noise of the ruined wedding and the wailing police sirens. I sank into the plush leather seat, pulling Harrison's bespoke jacket tighter around my shoulders. He sat directly across from me, his dark eyes studying my face with a mixture of intense pride and profound relief. The helicopter lifted off the ground smoothly, the powerful engine propelling us straight up into the darkening Rhode Island sky. I turned my head to look out the window. Down below, the sprawling historic estate looked incredibly small. The flashing red and blue police lights painted the white canvas of the reception tent in frantic rotating colors. I watched the scene shrink into the distance until it was nothing more than a tiny, insignificant speck against the vast, dark coastline. I had arrived at that estate as the designated scapegoat, a target for their cruelty, and a convenient bank account for their greed. I was leaving as the absolute architect of their destruction. I took a deep, cleansing breath, feeling the cold, salty ocean air being replaced by the pristine, filtered air of the aircraft cabin. The crushing weight of 33 years of emotional abuse, gaslighting, and relentless belittlement completely evaporated. I was finally, irrevocably free. 6 months later, the afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a sleek, high-rise boardroom overlooking the bustling Boston skyline. The office was a sanctuary of modern minimalist design, all polished mahogany brushed steel, and quiet, unshakable power. I sat at the head of the massive conference table, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that commanded absolute authority. Spread out before me were dozens of thick legal documents, each one meticulously drafted, reviewed, and finalized by my elite team of corporate attorneys. The past 6 months had been a masterclass in ruthless, systematic financial execution. Vanguard Citadel Partners, acting entirely under my strict directives, had moved with terrifying speed. We officially called in the entirety of Richard's corporate debt on the Monday morning following the wedding, exactly as promised. My father had attempted to file for emergency bankruptcy protection, desperately trying to shield his personal assets from the aggressive liquidation process. He failed spectacularly. The forensic audit my cybersecurity firm had conducted provided undeniable, irrefutable proof of his profound financial negligence and fraudulent accounting practices. The court showed him absolutely no mercy. His sprawling logistics empire was completely dissolved. His massive commercial fleet was seized and auctioned off to competitors. The luxurious Newport estate where he had proudly assaulted me was foreclosed upon by the bank, and his country club memberships were permanently revoked. Catherine had fared no better. The revelation regarding her theft of my educational trust fund had spread through the high society networks with devastating speed. The elite social circles she had worshipped entirely excommunicated her. She was forced to surrender her designer jewelry, her luxury vehicles, and her curated social standing. Brittany and Preston had faced their own catastrophic reckoning. The Manhattan penthouse purchased with my stolen trust money was immediately seized by federal creditors. Preston's hidden offshore credit accounts defaulted, resulting in aggressive litigation that permanently stripped him of his senior wealth manager title. The Golden Child and her fraudulent groom were currently navigating a vicious, highly publicized divorce, while living in a cramped budget apartment drowning in a mountain of inescapable debt. I picked up a heavy silver fountain pen from the mahogany table. Harrison's lead attorney, the same man who had served my father with the debt call-in notice at the ruined reception, stood quietly to my right. He respectfully slid the final decisive document across the polished wood toward me. "This is the final dissolution decree, Mrs. Cole," the attorney stated, his voice a low, professional murmur. "Once you sign this, Richard Vance's corporate entity will officially cease to exist. The liquidation of all remaining physical assets is fully complete. The margins have been covered. The firm is dead." I stared down at the crisp white paper. This single document represented the absolute end of the empire my father had loved more than his own daughter. It was the final nail in the coffin of his tyrannical reign. I did not feel a single ounce of hesitation, guilt, or remorse. I felt a deep, profound sense of justice. I pressed the silver nib of the pen to the signature line. The ink flowed smoothly, creating a sharp, decisive signature that officially erased my father's legacy from the corporate registry. The sound of the pen scratching against the heavy paper was the only noise in the quiet, elevated boardroom. I placed the pen back onto the table and pushed the signed document back to the attorney. "It is done," I said, my voice projecting absolute, unshakable calm. "File it immediately." The attorney nodded respectfully, gathering the thick stack of legal documents into his leather briefcase. He excused himself, quietly exiting the boardroom and leaving me entirely alone in the sunlit space. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, turning my gaze toward the sprawling city skyline outside the massive windows. The view was breathtaking, a physical manifestation of the heights I had reached entirely on my own merit, completely independent of the toxic people who had tried to drag me down. My smartphone, resting quietly on the polished mahogany table, suddenly vibrated, the screen illuminated, displaying a preview of a new text message. I glanced down, expecting an update from my cybersecurity firm's operations director. Instead, I saw a block of frantic, desperate text from an unknown, unsaved number. "Nina, please. It is Brittany. I know you changed your number, but I begged Aunt Susan for this one. Preston left me. The bank took the penthouse and all my accounts are frozen. I have absolutely nothing left. I am sleeping on a mattress on the floor. I know we have had our differences, but we are sisters. We are family. I just need a small loan to get back on my feet. Just $50,000. You will not even miss it. Please, Nina. You are the only one who can help me. Please do not ignore this." I stared at the glowing screen, reading the pathetic, entitled words of the golden child who had openly laughed while I was shoved into freezing water. She was still trying to weaponize the concept of family, completely blind to the fact that the word meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. She believed her suffering entitled her to my hard-earned resources. She still thought she could manipulate her way out of the consequences she had so eagerly created. I did not feel angry. I did not feel a surge of vindictive triumph. I felt absolutely nothing for the woman on the other end of that message. She was a ghost from a past life I had successfully burned to the ground. I calmly unlocked my phone, navigating directly to the message thread. I did not type out a scathing reply. I did not explain why she deserved her current misery. Any response would have been an engagement, a validation of her existence, and I refused to give her even a single fraction of my energy. I pressed the delete button, erasing her frantic plea from my device. I then selected the contact options and firmly pressed block, ensuring that Brittany, Richard, Catherine, and the entire toxic lineage could never reach me again. The digital boundary was just as ironclad as the physical one. I locked the phone screen, plunging the device back into darkness. A genuine warm smile spread across my face. I closed my laptop with a soft, satisfying click and placed it into my leather briefcase. I stood up from the head of the conference table, smoothing the lapels of my charcoal suit, feeling lighter and more powerful than ever before. I walked out of the high-rise boardroom, stepping into the private elevator that would take me down to the lobby. Harrison was waiting for me there, ready to take me to our favorite quiet restaurant for dinner. I was leaving the ruins of my past far behind me, permanently severed from the people who had tried to destroy my spirit. I walked out into the bright, bustling city, heading home to my husband, my peace, and my real family.